We'll call the meeting back to order. Obviously, we ran a little long on our lunch period and we're still missing a few people, but I think we can try to proceed, take up where we left off. And I understand we have our glitches all fixed now, and so I think we'll go back to the question that you had, that Matt, for Matt Sackett. And is Matt on right now? Okay.
Okay, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, the question I have at the Treasurer's office is, if we go to a 6% figure as opposed to the 9% in terms of the size of this reserve fund, there was some mention, which I didn't fully catch with the audiovisual difficulties that we had. There was some minimum figure that if we went over that, we could then invest that reserve fund in part in equities and get a better return. And if we go to the 6% figure, will that get us there?
Hey, are you on, Matt? Can you hear us?
I am, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, hopefully the audio and video are working better. I removed my USB camera, so just on the laptop. Chairman Scott, to your question, so CIO Patrick Fleming said a 5-year spend is kind of the minimum buffer you want to be able to invest more aggressively into equities and whatnot. So the 6%, I think the question is, if you assume a 0% return, that's probably not enough. We'll obviously make some interest in dividends. I feel like Patrick's point was that's kind of a minimum. So at 3 to 5, he said we could invest potentially part of it into equities, which you have designated with the LSRA. You kind of prescribed in statute, kind of a 3-tiered approach for the LSRA. So at the 6%, you might be somewhere in that range where part of it we might invest into equities, but keep the majority of it safe. If we go higher towards, that 9%, then we have a bigger buffer and would be able to invest more of it into equities. So there's probably a little wiggle room in there. So I don't know that there's a strict 6% or 9% answer, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Follow up? Or?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, just say the reason I asked the question is I do expect that the higher we go in that percentage, the more trouble I'm going to have with my Senate Appropriations Committee, who does want to build up reserve funds. I think maybe they've gone overboard a bit here, but I think I have much better chance of selling a 6% than I do a 9%. So I'm trying to figure out, what does the 6% actually get us? Because clearly we are entering a period where there's more risk, and it makes sense to have a larger reserve under those circumstances. And if we can invest it with a bit of higher return, that's a powerful argument too.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I can talk to Mr. Fleming and we can do a little work on that and get back with LSO.
That'd be great. All right. Where are we? We have any more discussion?
Move the bill.
Okay. Moved. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Conley.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
I'm going to urge us on this one. I think there's a couple of things I'd like to see drafted into it and have it brought back. I think their proposal to have the various figures divisible by 12, they got me convinced that that is a significant convenience. What I'd like to see is two alternatives. One where we always rounded up. So we went to the next highest level, had a little more there. And one where we followed the rule of rounding it up or down depending on which is closest. And I suppose if it's a tie, you round it up. But if we saw both of those, it's just complicated enough that I'd like to see, does it doing it either way make a significant difference in what the bill will do in terms of its overall monetary impact? So that's one thing, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to see. Second thing, I would like to see an amendment. Well, we could probably do this one on the fly, but I'd like to see an amendment to take it to 6% so that we have a better understanding from the treasurer's office and some others as to what that really does. Because I think that's an option that might make it much easier to pass. So, Mr. Chairman, I would, for those two reasons, like to see the options and vote on it next time.
Okay. Yes, Matt.
Mr. Chairman, I understand the 6%, that it would amend the current 9% reserve cap limit down to 6%. On your first question or your first proposed amendment, I understand that is you want to see an option of the award amounts be divisible by 12 or rounded up. And would you want it rounded up to the nearest $5, $10? What rounding do you want to see?
Mr. Chairman, I would like. I don't know that. But we need to at least look at that.
Yes, go ahead.
Just on that point, if we just made an assumption that arbitrarily 8,000 people were on Hathaway at any given time, which is high, right? That's significantly higher than the right answer. Then $12, which you wouldn't ever even achieve as your gap, gets us to $96,000. And so $96,000 is a ridiculous upper bound where the reality would always really be less than $50,000. So there's your answer.
Chairman.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I don't know if this would be a friendly amendment, but I had something prepared. I do look at the numbers. And for example, if you look on page 4, paragraph A, starting on line 4, we had proposed an amount that is $885 per semester. If you rounded that up to a number that's divisible by 12, it's 888. If you rounded it down, it's 876. So the amendment I was going to propose was, and so tell me if this is conceptual or could feed into what you're thinking, Senator. But instead of just having it broken out per semester, say $74 per credit hour, not to exceed $888 per semester at an eligible institution. That way we would see the math always. And so I think then in the future, we would have conversations about how much we would be increasing the per credit hour. And the thought would be of doing, then as we do that per credit hour, then you'll see it reflected in the per semester capped at 12. So if that's a friendly motion, I did the numbers for all of them, but if you want to save this to the next meeting, I would trust our LSO staff to do a much better job than me.
Senator, what's your take on that?
Mr. Chairman, Trying to think, I don't think we've jammed up our next meeting. I think Senator Ellis's approach has the value. It will get it worked out both ways. The question in my mind is, will it confuse people? Because I think the institutions, whoever has the choice, will always go to the higher number. So, but this would get it priced out both ways, and that has some virtues.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Representative.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And to Senator Ellis's point, if you word it right, so we were talking about these students who maybe are only using 1 or 2, credit hours or 3 credit hours or 4 credit hours in a semester because they're in a specialized program. If you worded it like she did and provided flexibility, like Senator Ellis did, and provided flexibility on the semester hours, then it kind of takes care of it. You really see it, right? You see that it's $74 per credit hour, and this individual is going to use 3. You can kind of open it up that way as well, because then you actually see the fraction laid out. Does that make sense, Senator Ellis?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. So the goal is really for future legislators, when they want to increase the amount awarded under here, instead of looking at the per semester hour, I think it would focus it more on the per credit hour. And then, if we're like 74 is not high enough in 5 years, we want to look at inflation rates, then we just look at that credit hour and then you multiply it by 12 to get your upper bound. So it's not intended to be a big change to the bill, but for future years, so that we're mindful of that.
Yeah, and I agree. That would be easier to calculate, to look at, and to understand.
Mr. Chairman?
Are we given enough direction to LSO to get where we want to go? Okay, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So my question is, you all sent me the statute on 2116-304A, Romanet I, B, A and B. So is the opportunity scholarship the only one that has the provision that you can go down to 6 hours? Is that common with all of them?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Summers, it's present with all the levels of scholarship. You can get 6 hours of scholarship eligibility.
So, Mr. Chairman, it would be my suggestion, along with Senator Ellis's, that we, in that subsection B, we reduce it down to where you can take an hour. You don't need to take 6 hours. Take 2 hours.
Senator Office.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One consideration on that, and I don't know where we left it because we actually changed this a number of years ago, but you burn semesters of eligibility. So if I have a 3 credit hour semester and I use 3 credit hours worth of my Hathaway, or 6, I should say, 6 credit hours right now, and use only 6 of the 12, I don't get the rest of that money. I burn a semester. If we take it down to 1 hour, I've now burned 11 hours worth of my Hathaway. There's a lot of landmines that are kind of built into the current structure of this legislation that if we fix one thing, there often are unintended consequences. And Mr. Chairman, I remember a number of years ago, we addressed an issue where at the university, at the colleges, summer courses and January terms were counting as semesters, basically. So they'd take a course and then they would lose a full semester of eligibility for the Hathaway. We addressed that by saying count those as a part of the other semester. So that was sort of a makeshift kludge that worked. But if we do something along these lines where we allow partial billing, it benefits from the flexibility standpoint, but financially it's really bad for the students. We're not giving them their due at that point, since they can burn a full semester of eligibility by using 1 credit hour. So something to contemplate as we work through this.
Well, let's go to Representative Summers first, then we'll come back to you.
So, Mr. Chairman, I don't disagree, but there's a lot of students that are never going to go back and use the rest of that. So the thing is, if you have somebody in an apprenticeship, now we could change the language and make a C and say that, you can reduce down if you're going into a credential program, or, we could tailor that. My point is, I guess, I think this amendment fits this bill. Whatever that looks like, whatever this hour looks like, I think it fits this bill. The broader discussion of whether we create a pot of money that you can use for, the next 20 years to fund education at institutions, that's a separate bill. We have to have a separate discussion on. But I think this fits uniquely in here. And I think that, I think that's a good discussion right now with the group, because I do agree that, whether it's a electrician apprenticeship or a welder or whatever, if you're going to go get 3 or 4 hours and you're not going to be able to use your halfway, that doesn't make sense to me. So we could make a C and have staff work on it, or we could, however the group likes.
Yes, Mr. Co-Chair.
I think Senator Ruffus has a good point here on this one. And I think we could fix it by changing the rules, but I think it'd be a mistake to do so for 2 reasons. One, I think the administrative cost of doing one for an hour is the same as doing one for the full amount or half the amount. I don't think there's going to be any significant change in that cost, Mr. Chairman. And so I think it's more efficient and in a scale that will probably make a difference to do it the way we're doing it now. And second, whereas I want to accommodate with some of the partial things, somebody that is going to run a very limited program, we would also tend to accommodate people who just want to be professional students. And I think that's not a wise use of our resources. So frankly, Mr. Chairman, I think we'd be better off leaving it at 6.
Okay. Yes, Representative Conley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got a question for the community college folks. How many hours does it take to get a certificate in, pick something, diesel mechanics, something that is not academic, not transferable, but available at a community college, which gets to directly what's being talked about here, where you might have an apprenticeship program that a student would be engaged in order to ultimately get that certificate from the community college. Because in all honesty, if it's basically a credit class that you take for 3 semesters, I would tend to agree with reducing it to an hour. But if instead it really is 3 or 6 hours every semester to get a 9-credit certificate, then Senator Rothfuss's point about burning your Hathaway dollars could really hurt students. So I am real curious, just for information.
Who would like to field that question?
There's a lot of room.
Dr.
between
Dr.
that
Caldwell
six.
must be.
Yes. What is it? It's a 3-credit.
Mr. Chairman, I'm Sandy Caldwell, Executive Director of the Wyoming Community College Commission. Representative Connolly, I didn't hear all of that, so I want to make sure I fully understand what you were asking.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Dr. Caldwell, I'm curious about the kind of apprenticeship programs that Lisa was talking about that would get offered in a community college credential program, and the hours that it would take in a community college program, in particular per semester, so that we can accommodate the desire to allow for those apprenticeship programs to be covered by the Hathaway, but not burn up Hathaway usage.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And another way to look at that is what is the minimum credit course you have in a community college through an apprentice program or anything else? What's the very minimum credit hours?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Connolly, Representative Summers, there's a couple of ways to look at this and to answer the question. Some of the apprenticeship programs have equivalent credit hours, some of them do not. There is no Hathaway currently for the non-credit certifications and credentials. However, the community colleges do have multiple credentials, certificates at the colleges. We have two really distinct types of those. We have those that are stackable and they actually are apart and build into an associate degrees, for example, in an AAS program. And then we have some of those certificates that are short certificates that are standalone. I will need to get those exact numbers for you because we have a little bit of a varying amount. And I also want to make sure that I can give you what the apprenticeships for the non-credit would be. But currently there's no eligibility for any of those non-credit credentials. Right now, the only pathway we have for those is through the Wyoming Works.
Mr. Chairman? Maybe to keep this moving,
Go ahead.
maybe to keep this moving along, I think, Senator Scott suggested doing a couple numbers adjustments. If additional work wants to be done and brought with an amendment that LSO prepares and sorts through some of these details, I just don't want to get us bogged down in debating a new concept right now and just trying to be mindful of our time.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I think if staff just builds in a C and leaves it open, that we're going to look at this, I think that's good. And then in those sections, and then we can try to figure out what makes sense with what we get back from the community colleges.
Is that clear as mud? Tanya, did LSO kind of get an idea of what?
Mr. Chairman, I understand the purpose of the amendment. We'll work with the Community College Commission, understand what the accredited certificates require on a credit hour basis. And we can certainly propose an amendment to be considered at the November meeting that does that.
Senator Office.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. A concept that I think would meet Representative Summers' interest and maybe even simplify this is if you look at, for example, the construction on page 4, the paragraph A that we're amending. The language that sort of causes the challenge is if enrolled for 12 or more courses and, credit hours, semester hours. If that language were removed and you basically just allowed up to that amount per semester towards tuition and fees, that's a simple way to work within this bill and just basically say you can use up to this amount of money. And we're not going to care how many credit hours you take, but if you're not spending it, you're not using it. It still has the problem of maybe you're underusing your funds. But getting towards what's the fix within this bill, that would, I think, accomplish what you're interested in, which is ensuring that you can use those funds towards any program you wanted, if it's tuition and fees, and would just simplify it. So it's one consideration as well. I don't know what Representative Summers thinks of that idea, but I think it solves his concerns.
Representative Summers.
So, Mr. Chairman, yeah, that certainly works for me. That's actually a nice trade-off between the bill. It would be here's your full pot of money. You can use it over the course of 10 years, have at it, so to speak, versus this more structured program, which gives you the authority within a semester, which I think it's a good option for us to consider at our next meeting.
Okay, anything else?
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Harshman.
Mr. Chairman, I just would like to move this concept amendment, have it ready it's on page 2. It's really all this timing issue stuff. We've gone round and round about percentages and timing. And Mr. Wilmarth, Mr. Richards, Ms. Hogue, Senator Rothfuss and myself and we've been talking about this since June, we've all had a little bit different ideas. And I think our staff kind of has had the idea of and you heard it earlier today from Mr. Wilmarth, if you go the statute 21-16-1302 on the top of page 2, you just see paragraph B there. And that is the reserve account. And paragraph A is actually the expenditure account, and really just combining those two accounts. Just make one account, set the reserve limit at 9%, it'd be 60 million. before it tips. And then we don't have to mess with timing or any of that. It'll be big enough to stay in there. Then I think for this part, well, we're going to lose some investment return. Maybe they can work in some language where to give the state treasurer some flexibility as he sees fit to invest portions of that reserve into pool A. And then, so what you have here, because right now what we have is a system that sweeps the money. So it's broke when you have to pay the bills. Then you got to pull from the reserve account. And people don't understand that. And they say, well, the Hathaway's run out of money. We can't pay our bills. This would make, and you heard the treasurer say, man, we just don't want to take it from the right pocket to the left pocket and back to the right pocket. And it's just a managerial problem. So I think I'm back on really our staff suggestion of one account. And then we don't have to mess with any of the dates. That would put, if we kept it at 9%, Mr. Chairman, that is 60 million before it rolls into the corpus. That's 3 years of scholarships at 0%. I mean, if we have a Great Depression and we get 0%, we can still pay our bills for 3 years and give us some time to roll with that. And that number, that 60 million, 9% cap account, that's in 2026. That's on page 3, table 3 of the handout that Ms. Hogue put together for us. So it'd be 52 million right now and 60 million in a few years. So I just think to have that amendment ready to clean this thing up when we vote on it at our next meeting, Mr. Chairman. So that's my motion on that.
Okay. Been moved and seconded. We heard the motion. Yes.
I would hope we would also analyze what would happen if instead of 9%, we said 6%. I am envisioning we go too high there, I'm going to have trouble passing it in the Senate.
Right. Mr. Chairman.
Yes,
And
go
Mr.
ahead.
Chairman, that is on that table 3 on page 3. That'd be right in the middle at 40 million in the reserve. Right now, it's about 30. This is 2026, a few years from now. 30, 40, or 60. That's how I read that. Is that right? In 2026? 30, 40, and 60. Currently, it would be 26, 35, and 52.
Senator Office.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And to be clear, this is just an amendment or a motion to have an amendment drafted, right? So
Right, I guess
something to consider for next time. Not necessarily to amend the bill right now since the bill hasn't been moved, but I do think it's a good motion and certainly something worth discussing. And this is one that I support. We had the opportunity, Representative Harshman and I and staff, to talk through this concept. And recall at the last meeting, I was reticent to raise the total amount for the reason that Chairman Scott's discussing, that we wouldn't be investing the funds and that we'd end up with a loss of opportunity. The discussion we had is if you go to a 9% account and you combine the two and you understand what your cash flow is likely to look like, part of the motion was let's give flexibility to the treasurer's office to put some of the funds into pool A instead of leaving it in the agency pool. So you can imagine a circumstance, for example, where under regular conditions, when you're not short on funds, 4.5% of that 9% is in pool A, earning revenue, just as if it were in the corpus. And the other 4.5% is managing cash flow. Then you have a downturn. Well, you get a warning ahead of time. You talk to the treasurer and you say, we're going to need some funds to provide cash flow for Hathaway. Right now, you can't touch the corpus, right? We actually have no emergency reserve approach for Hathaway right now. If that reserve account were to fall, and we've just been fortunate that we've never been in that circumstance, but this provides that backstop for a number of years where you could literally have no revenue and you have some runway there where you're able to touch an equity investment. You would have to know ahead of time, contemplate it, liquidate the investment and then flow the pool A investment back into an agency pool cash availability. But I think the elegance there is that it should be satisfactory to the interests that we've heard on the Senate side, where they want to make sure that we're investing those funds and getting yield off of it instead of just putting it in the agency pool. So I appreciate the concept and support it.
Mr. Co-Chair?
And Mr. Chairman, I think that has some real virtue. There is another reason why we might have trouble, and that is that by putting it all the way into the permanent fund, then the Appropriations Committee can't be under pressure to raid the reserve account and fund some new program that would be a detriment to the ongoing program. So I think we'll have to look at the balances there and see what's the best way. If I think the calculation is if we lose all the funding, you're talking about 2 years worth. I think in practice, we would lose the capital gains, but not the interest and dividends. I think they'd be relatively constant. So we're probably buying 4 years of protection.
Okay, anyone else? All right,
Mr. Chairman.
yes.
Just, Mr. Chairman, just one more thing, and just so they don't think we entirely ignored it, there was this idea, do we want to bring the honors up to $1,800 per semester to be consistent with a federal grant? And my opinion on that is it's not a bad idea, but we don't really know the details yet. And it's something I think we could do at session if we knew more about what that future program is going to look like. So,
Okay, so
I think we leave it that.
right now we're on the Harshman Amendment.
Okay.
And so if there's no more discussion on the Harshman Amendment, I'd ask for a vote. Are you ready for the question?
Question.
All in favor of the amendment signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The amendment is carried. Okay, back on the bill. Where are we? Yes.
Mr. Chairman, did you want that as a separate amendment or you want that incorporated into the bill draft? The Harshman Amendment. The other ones were conceptual. I thought we were going to bring back, or on all these, do you want these as separate amendments or do you want them incorporated in the bill draft?
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I would suggest we incorporate this one in the bill draft, because I think the issue where we may change things, we might back it out, but I think the more likely change would be to change the 9% to 6% or 7%, and that's a simple amendment we can do right on the fly.
Okay.
Okay. You all right with that? All right, anything else? Are we ready to table the motion until the next meeting? Isn't that the appropriate way to deal with this at this point in time?
Mr. Chairman, I don't think anybody moved the bill, so we'll just come back with the.
It was
updated version.
moved and
Okay.
seconded.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, tabling the bill.
so I think the only choice would be to table the motion until the next meeting. So the chair would entertain a motion to table.
So move.
Moved by, seconded by Mr. Co-Chair, moved by Representative Summers. All in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed, no. Okay, the motion is carried. The bill is carried over until our next meeting.
Mr. Chairman, before we move on,
What's that?
okay, before we move on, I have one more kind of request actually based on this bill.
Okay,
And it's with Ms. Kennedy. Ms. Kennedy, I'm trying to find the kind of apprenticeship program that you mentioned that is not getting enough recognition in the community colleges for eligibility for the Hathaway. And I'm not finding anything. So I'm like looking at Sheridan's diesel mechanics and Western Wyoming. So could you please get with the Community College Commission to explain a little bit more so we understand exactly what it is that we're fixing next time? Great, thank you.
okay. Senator Rothfuss.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. One other thing before we leave Hathaway, we've had a lot of discussion about the bill that was drafted for the Wyoming's Tomorrow Task Force a couple of years ago, and then COVID happened and we never really brought it forward. We didn't introduce that legislation or bring it to the Education Committee, which was originally the plan. To me, it seems like a more elegant solution to all of the challenges that we've discussed today, with providing an opportunity to have what is effectively a debited card approach for your Hathaway funds, regardless of how much they are. It solves most all of these problems that we've discussed and does it directly. So the concept briefly in that bill is, rather than having a certain number of semesters and a certain number of credit hours over a certain number of years and all of the restrictions, the Hathaway would be recognized as what it was originally intended, which was basically based on your high school performance. You receive a certain amount of funds. Those funds don't need to change from the amounts that are in here for the same requirements that are in here. But it would go into an account that you could then expend over some number of years. I think it's drafted with like 15 years, if I'm not mistaken, 20.
Yeah, I got
You got it in front of you?
Yeah.
So you've got 20 years to spend the dollars that you've earned on education at a Wyoming college or university. And it takes all the strings off and just kind of lets you pick your fate and your path and use them to the best of your ability in the way you want. I ask that we bring that to the next meeting and consider that without objection, take a look at that and potentially sponsor it. If anyone wants to discuss it more, we can do that now, but nobody's read it unless they've been on the Wyoming Tomorrow Task Force. So I think we should all have it in front of us before we really dig in.
Chair.
Mr. Chairman, are you asking for a separate bill or for a draft?
Gotcha. Mr. Chairman, I think the separate standalone bill is the way to look at that. It's a wholly different bill. It would be an awkward amendment to this bill. And it would be very easy to conform that bill to the changes that we're suggesting in this bill of simply changing the funds, which is the rest of the bill. And honestly, if we wanted to do both of the bills afterwards, we'd probably keep this bill, the first 2 pages, which address the funding formula, sever the rest of this bill, which deals with the amounts, and then work with the other bill would be the way to do that next time, which is again, pretty clean and easy. So basically asking that staff take the bill from a couple of years ago and turning it into a draft for our consideration at the next
And I think
meeting.
we've already talked about that with staff, so, yes.
Mr. Chairman, I don't have any objection to having a bill like that drafted. I strongly suspect that it would raise considerable opposition. Maybe that's just because my first instinct is that transforms this into just we're going to pass out free money kind of entitlement. And I think there'll be a lot of opposition to that, Mr. Chairman. And I think if we tried to amend it in here, we might well kill this bill. I think it would have to be a standalone thing.
And I believe that was the intent, and the bill's already drafted, so it would just be a matter of bringing it back to us. So it wouldn't require any redrafting. We'll just take a look at it and see where we are.
Mr. Chairman, I don't mind doing that. If we've got time on the agenda, I think we probably will. But I do have some real reservations about the whole concept.
Yes, Matt, go ahead.
Mr. Chair, this is just a clarification to Senator Office. Would you want the 5% increase on the total award amount inclusive or included in that bill draft that is proposed in this bill? So the total amount that would be awarded would be increased by 5% from that bill draft, and or do you want the amounts that were contemplated in that bill to stay the same?
Mr. Chairman, honestly, you could probably leave it as what was in the bill. We can change those numbers and up them by 5% if we make that as a motion and amendment to, I don't know that it matters very much. 5% is not going to be very significant. Thank you. But Mr. Chairman, now responding to the concerns of the handout, I do think that's worth having as a discussion and exploring it more. When we worked it on the Wyoming Tomorrow Task Force, I don't remember any opposition to it. It really just seemed like a very good idea and a sensible idea. So I'll look forward to that discussion if folks come forward and are afraid that allowing students to make their own decisions about how they spend their earned scholarship funds as a handout. We'll see how that goes.
Okay, where are we? Public comment, I guess, maybe?
Mr. Chairman, did we decide to go ahead and get that bill drafted?
The last one we talked about,
Yeah.
it's already drafted, it's just bringing it back, but yeah. Okay, any public comment on the Hathaway Scholarship Program or anything we've discussed up to this point?
There's no online comment, no.
Okay, I guess we're ready to move on. That brings up community college funding, so it must be 1 p.m., huh?
Somewhere.
Dr. Caldwell, Mr. Buholtz.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee,
There we go.
here we go.
All right.
I am Dr. Sandy Caldwell, Executive Director of the Community College Commission. And I will have Mr. Buckles introduce himself in just a moment. I wanted to ask permission of the chairman if it would be agreeable with you to allow Ms. Erin Taylor to join us.
That'd be great. Fine. Come on up.
Mr. Chairman, this is part of a housekeeping item. The materials handed out at the beginning of yesterday's meeting included an additional presentation from the Community College Commission that's not in your packets. It was part of that additional material. So that is the presentation, one of the materials they'll be speaking from.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
And Mr. Chairman, I do want to introduce the presidents who are, I believe, with us today. We do have in the room with us Dr. Walt Tribely. He is the president of Northern Wyoming Community College District. We do have several of our presidents who are in Zoom land today that I wanted to make sure that I introduced as well. We do have Dr. Leslie Travers from Eastern Wyoming College. We have Dr. Kim Dale from Western Wyoming Community College. We have Ms. Lisa Watson. She's at Northwest College. We have Dr. Tyndall from Central Wyoming College. I'm not certain if we have Dr. Devine because he was also attending joint appropriations for us today. And then from Casper College, and then Dr. Joe Schaefer from Laramie County Community College. I think I got them all and did not miss one
And
today.
thank you to all of them and thank you for joining us. All right, go ahead.
You want to introduce?
Good afternoon, committee. Larry Buckholz, Chief Financial Officer for the commission.
And good afternoon, members of the committee. My name is Erin Taylor. I'm the Executive Director of the Wyoming Association of Community College Trustees. And with your permission, Mr. Chairman, I'd also like to introduce to you Trustee Kathy Dolan, who's in the audience. She's a trustee here at Casper College, and she is currently the Vice President of the WACD Board of Directors.
Okay, let's proceed.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, members of the committee, we did provide quite a few documents for you today in follow-up to our meeting in Saratoga where we provided you information. And I also wanted to share that we have put together a presentation, if we can get that up on the screen, where we've really tried to distill all of that information for you to really move through it and to be able to make sense of that. Documents that you do have that were attached. One of those is the college budget from 2008 through 22. And then we also provided you the full report from the sustainable funding work. And we also provided you the shorter brief summary of all of that work. And we'll be pulling all of that information together for you to try to really move through to get the high points of really what you asked for in that last meeting. So we have that up on the screen and we are going to go through that. And I think it will help distill those multiple pages of the college budget so that you can really see what how that has been occurring over many, many years. So if we can go to the next slide. And this really starts with something that we shared with you last time, and that is the college budget system, the design of it versus how it's actually happening. When we shared at your meeting in Saratoga, we talked about there's a three-part allocation model on how the funds are distributed to the colleges and what sort of the targeted funding design of that is. And you'll actually see what actually occurs in those budgets that is in that attachment from over time. And we've selected certain years to really help us move through what that process is. There's a three-part allocation model design.
I think we're ready to proceed.
Okay, ready to proceed. Great. Okay, so what we wanted to share with you is what the design is, but what is it actually? That continues to come up on how we need to communicate that and make sure that we're sharing what is designed versus how it is actually occurring at the institutions. And we did a very deep dive on this through the sustainable funding. So hopefully we can pull it together. By design, state aid is intended to be 60%. The mills/local, so that's the assessed 4 mills, the optional 1 mill, and then some additional local revenue in the form of motor vehicle revenue. And then the third part of that is the tuition and fees at 20%. So that's the structural design that was initiated. The reality of where we are going into, and we're going to move through this, what is looking to be projected in the upcoming biennium is state aid will actually make up 51% of the funding, 22% on the mills and local revenue, and we're looking at about 27% on the students paying the tuition and the fees. And just to let everyone be aware, the commission did raise tuition in their tuition meeting last October. That went into effect this semester. So that's the status of that. We go on to the next one. I'm going to let Larry talk about this next slide, because this is an illustration of what that looks like in the model. Many of you have seen this graphic before, but I wanted to let Larry kind of walk through how that comes together.
Thank you, Dr. Caldwell. Mr. Chairman, the bubble in the middle up there is not the same 60% that is portrayed on the previous slide. This is just the state aid portion that the funding allocation model distributes among the 7 institutions that get state aid. So of that state aid amount, whatever it happens to be, whatever that appropriation is, we take 60% of it and it gets allocated out to the colleges based on their fixed costs, certain salaries, utilities, whatever the proportion is of their actual expenditures over a period of 4 years, averaged out across the system, they get 60% of the funding is allocated out for those costs specifically to each institution. It's not affected by enrollment. It's not affected by weighted credit hour delivery, nothing like that. It's segregated out and distributed to them based on a history of their actual costs for their fixed cost categories in their balance sheet. The other 40% we take out, and it goes through a couple of different calculations. That 40% is divided in two, 50-50, and then the colleges get a portion of 50% of the 40% based on their actual enrollment. So it is adjusted year to year to year to year in the funding allocation model based on how their enrollment goes up and down and ebbs and flows over a period of time. And then the other part of it is distributed to them based on some performance metrics. So one is strictly on enrollment. That's all it is. The other one is their performance. Their performance is identified as the number of weighted credit hours the number of successfully completed weighted credit hours that they deliver. So that means students who receive a grade of C or higher, credit hour is weighted based on those 4 levels of instructions that are included in statute now as a result of House Bill 80. If it's an online class, it's weighted at a 0.8. If it's a lecture class, it's weighted as a 1. And then there's a level 2, which is weighted at a 1.25, and then a high demand, low enrollment course, which is a level 3, which is weighted at 1.5. And when I say that low enrollment, I mean that enrollment is restricted by accreditation or some other factor, such as nursing. You can only have 8 students per instructor. So that's a high cost type of a program. So they earn more funding for delivery of that kind of a program or those types of credit hours. That's what I mean by that. So they get an allocation based on the percentage or proportion of those weighted credit hours that each institution delivers in that one given year. Another portion of that money is segregated out, and it's delivered on successfully completed degrees and certificates. So we have a table that shows high value degrees and certificates. And if those are conferred to a student, then they get a point. How many points are across the system? Whatever proportion of those that you delivered, that's how much money you get in the funding allocation for that. So, I mean, that's a real high level of how the funding allocation model works. Again, I will say that unlike K-12, the local revenue that's collected at the institutions, at that taxing district, the county in which that college resides, all of that funding stays at that college. It does not get redistributed in any way across the system. That revenue paid by that local resident in that county stays in that county. That's what it is. There is no redistribution. We do a redistribution of state aid. So in the funding allocation model, we consider what their local revenue projection is. We consider what the state aid is. From that, we derive a revenue per credit hour based on the history of credit hours that are delivered, and we distribute based on this formula using that revenue per credit hour. If local revenue comes in higher during the recapture redistribution process, we'll take away from some state aid and we'll redistribute that to a college that may have had their local revenue go down. It happens even if everybody's revenue goes down. Money changes hands because it's not going to be in the same proportion across all 7 colleges. Likewise, if everybody's local revenue goes up, there will be some, the exact opposite. So we account for that, but we only do that on the state aid portion of things, not the local revenue.
Mr. Co-Chair?
Chairman, I'd like to ask a question or two to make sure I understand this formula. And let me just use an example. As I understand this, there's 3 different ways you earn money when you get a student. You earn it for just having a student. You earn it if the student successfully completes a credit hour, and you earn it if a student successfully completes a degree. Mr. Chairman, I'll use the example. I'm taking a course right now. I enrolled in a course in plate tectonics in the geology department up at Casper College. Given by Kent Sundell, who is an instructor that's as good as I've seen anywhere. I pay a fee for that course, and that stays as a local resource and cannot be redistributed, although it does affect the amount of total state aid you get. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, no. When it comes to the tuition and fees portion of the revenue that the colleges receive, it is not considered in the calculation of that revenue per credit hour that I mentioned. That is a calculation that is just state aid and the local mill. That is all. That's all that's in that calculation. We do not consider revenue in the form of tuition and fees in any of the allocations that we do.
That revenue is not considered in the allocation, Mr. Chairman, but is available for the college to expand.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, that's correct. Yeah, it's unrestricted revenue for the colleges.
And if I take that course and do not seek credit, I got my degree a long time ago, don't need another one, and don't care to write the paper. I get counted as a student, but only as a student in that first level you were talking about.
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. If a student is enrolled as of the census date, which is 12% completion of a semester, they're counted as a student.
So, but the students that are with me in the class that think they may eventually work toward a degree and want credit, they are counted as if they successfully complete that course. They are counted.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, that is the next component of the funding allocation, yes.
They've gotten counted twice compared to the one that's just auditing the course.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, you could look at it that way, but we take 50% of the 40% and distribute it based on one metric, and then 50% of that other 40% and distribute it based on a different metric. Yes, it could be the same student, but it's a different metric.
And then there's another metric for those that actually complete a degree. Is that right?
It incentivizes the colleges to make sure that their students are complete.
I would like to thank you for bringing this explanation, because I have not understood the formula until now. And it does seem to me to be a rational formula.
Yes, Representative Overmiller.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. In earlier testimony, I believe I heard that some of the courses provided don't translate to credit hours, that there's certain other programs that don't seem to appear here that wouldn't actually fit this second metric. Could you explain that, please? Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Obermiller, this is for credit courses. The colleges are not funded for non-credit courses.
Follow up?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And the other piece is, could you just talk a little bit more about how you rank the completed certificates and degrees? It sounded like some were considered more important than others. Just talk about that. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative Obermiller, you're correct. There was a committee established between commission staff and staff at each one of the institutions that went through the complete list of credentials that are conferred and ranked them based on criteria at the high end, high demand, high skill,
High wage. And high wage.
and high wage. The degrees that we really want to deliver and get people out there with a livable wage down to, let's just say, an average of the value of that credential that's delivered. So they're weighted incrementally, 3 different weights And we pull that information out of the system and then plug those numbers into the funding allocation.
Okay,
Mr. Chairman,
yes, Mr. Coachella.
following up on that. And again, I'm using the example. I had a niece that went to Casper College when she was a high school student and enrolled in a course that got her a CNA designation, so immediately employable. Now, my understanding is that under the formula you're just discussing, something like that would count, but it might not count as much as some other certificate degree because it is a relatively short program.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, yes. Yeah, a short-term certificate is obviously going to carry a lot less weight, even though it may be a high demand. It's going to carry something in the middle. It's not going to be at the upper end, say, like a full RN degree, or on the certificate side, a welding certificate. They're going to be on the higher end.
And Mr. Chairman, that makes sense because it is producing people that I can assure you we desperately need, but it is not as expensive to do. So it sounds to me like, again, we've got a rational formula here.
That's what I would say. Okay, proceed.
If we could, let's go back to the presentation. And we wanted to bring up that next slide. And if we could, then I think it's yes, on that one. And if we could click on that link, we just want to showcase this just for a moment, and then we'll come back because this is a lot of data that was specifically requested at the last meeting. And we want to then move through explaining and distilling this large amount of information. So you have, I think it's 15 some pages of a year to year. The colleges do budget annually, even though we have a biennial process, but we make sure that we live in, at the commission, we live in both worlds intentionally. So you had asked specifically for each of the college's budgets. These are the estimated budgets based on what was approved, and then how that wraps up into the system. And then we wanted you to see the full amount, but we wanted to then pull out those parts that are the unrestricted funds that the colleges have. There are a lot of funds that the colleges have that are restricted in use, and many of those are what you see in the auxiliary enterprises. They have to fund themselves. Something like housing, food service, those are self-funding enterprises that are not used under the state appropriations. This is why they are separated out. So we're really looking at what the unrestricted funding for the colleges are. So we wanted to call out specific line items here, and then that's what we're going to move through in the presentation to really help you digest this large amount of information fairly quickly. So there is the state aid appropriation. That is a line there. We wanted you to see the what happens where the local appropriations and the 4 mills are created. So we broke those out just so you could see them, what their proportion of the 4 mill is that is statutorily required, and then the optional mill for the colleges, along with the additional motor vehicle and some other local revenue that is there. And then the tuition and fees. And we also had to back out of that, I think, the non-credit component that was in here. So we wanted you to see the full tilt. For example, non-credit has to be floating again on its own. There is no state appropriation for that. So what you have are multiple pages. We picked out some really specific years to help move through digesting this amount of information so you could see everything that Larry just described in how the allocation works for the state aid proportion, and also how the colleges combine all of that, those funding sources to create their unrestricted budgets. So then if we could go back to the slide presentation, we'll start to pick specific ones to help us move through this and then bring you up to what we're looking at in the current, the upcoming biennium. Okay. So we went through a period of years in here because this would be very arduous to go through every single one of those. But I think you can see the trends that we're going to be picking out. So we picked out those very specific components, the local mills and state, the local mills and the 4 mil. We separated those out so that you could see them, but they create that 120% block. So in 2010, and the reason we use 2010 very frequently, and we reference it quite a lot, is that was the last time there was a consideration of enrollment growth. So what has occurred, we have the allocation model. We don't have any mechanism in which to account for cost increases. And that's what you're going to see, because the way it works now, even with the recalibration process, it assumes the value of the dollar is the same since 2010. And that's the part of the conundrum that we come up with. So just to start with 2010, since that was the last enrollment growth, we see the total budget that is the unrestricted. That's the combination of state aid, the 4 mills, the 1 mill plus the motor vehicle, and then the tuition and fees at the colleges. And this is where we want to have you take a look at where it's designed to be 60%, 20%, 20%. In 2010, it was about 56.5% state aid. And then the local mill, the 4 mills and the additional 1 mill plus the motor vehicle was about 23.6, and tuition and fees was almost at the 20%. And we then picked out a next one, and there, we really just didn't pick specific ones as we were going through. We weren't targeting any specific one after that. It's just 2010 was where we wanted to start. And then we wanted to just get some snapshots for you to see what's happening to the individual colleges. So each of those amounts that are listed on this chart, that are listed here, are derived directly from the spreadsheet that you just saw. You can pick each one of those numbers out of that chart to recreate this at any point. So hopefully that makes it clear. So then moving on to 2013, you see the total budget had increased. We were getting closer to that 60%, right? 58.3%, 20% on the mills and local, but tuition is starting to rise a little bit, 21.3%. And the commission has raised tuition over this time period. I just want to be very clear about that. So, and you can see the legend at the bottom. I sort of wish now I've used red, green, blue, and not shades of blue. Apologies for that. We can clean this up actually and change that and get it back to you with clear colors. If we can go to the next slide. Okay. And so we're watching this continue on over time so that you can really begin to see what's occurring. Total budget, again, you're looking at the state aid proportion, 56.6. Right here, that amount is about 116.7. Local mills at this point, you're going to see them sort of float around, and then you're going to start to see this tuition and fees continue to increase as a proportional amount to really try to help the colleges paying their bills, frankly, because there is that increase, and we'll show you that in just a minute, actually where it is. 2017, this is post penny plan. This is the post penny plan from the 2016-17 cuts. And you will see that we're still tracking okay, but again, tuition kicking up just a little bit again on this one. Do you want to add anything to that?
I'm sorry.
Do you want to add anything to that? Keep going. Keep going.
Keep going.
We'll flip to the next one. Okay, getting to more recent and what we're really starting to feel the crunch on with the colleges is that state aid is starting to drop right here. We really see that impact from 2017. And you see tuition come up again on this component. And if we'll watch that number and it tracks directly from that chart, you'll start to see that percentage of state aid, which is that largest blue block, is continuing to slide further and further away from that 60%. And then what we wanted to do is really show you what it looked like pre-cuts, then where it is in the cuts, and then what that's going to look like in the next year so that you can see them very quickly. So then in 2021, this was the budget adoption, correct, Larry?
Right.
The budget adoption, and then the subsequent cuts happened. But before that happened, this is where it looked, and that's what you see in that chart. Still sliding down, however, because the state aid allocation is becoming a smaller portion of that total amount, down to 54.3%. But you see again, tuition kicking up a little bit again on the cost to the students. And then if we'll go to the next slide, we pulled forward that same chart so that we could put them side by side for you, because we felt like we probably got enough to show the picture, decreasing amount of state aid, increasing on cost to the college, to the students themselves on tuition and fees. So right here, you can see that state aid amount, not only is it becoming a smaller proportion, the amount is also less. And I think that's an important thing to note, because what Mr. Buckles did in the second chart is then he put in the step 2, but remember, it's only for 1 year, because we're showing you the snapshot per year, because that's how the colleges have to do their budget. And at that point, it has 52%. Again, tuition increase came forward, because I think that was adopted in 2018 or 19. So then tuition and fees carrying a higher percentage. And you see that that reduction, not only in the percentage, but in the amount of the state aid. And so one thing to also, can we go to the next one? Because I think this one's really important. This one is where we have projected what that's going to look like when the step 2 and step 3 cuts are then biennialized. And that's important because that's what we're moving into this next session. And so you see then what it's looking like with the 2 and the 3. Do you want to mention the 8 million in there, or do you want me to just go on?
I'll just say that when you're looking at the slide, that's the fiscal year 21 actual post-step 2 cuts. That is only the step 2 cuts, that 10% that was imposed for the colleges, that translated to $22.5 million. So 11 and some change in 1 year. That was the actual hard cut. You don't see it as clearly here in the pre-21 step 2, step 3, and the post step 2 cuts because of the timing. This is what the colleges budgeted. The colleges start their budget formulation in March and April of every spring. They do it based on the appropriation that was given to them in the spring of 20, right after the budget session in 20. And then the budget cuts were announced after that. Their budgets were already done. They didn't really receive this much money.
Sure.
The budgets were already done for them, and that's what this data reflects. It doesn't. So it says they got $108 million pre, and it says they got $104 million post. It does not really account for the $11 million we did reduce their budgets because it wasn't in the timing the right way.
Right.
We didn't do the cuts until after their budgets were in effect. That's right. We didn't do the cuts until June and July of 20. Their budgets had to be done for their board prior to the cuts. The boards adopted a budget that didn't contemplate the cuts that were coming to them, that we didn't put into the state budget system. The governor didn't adopt those until August, those step 2 cuts, right? So there's an impact there that you don't really see.
And one thing to mention in is that is throughout that year, the colleges and their boards of trustees made those cuts. And again, that's why then when you come to what we're looking at for 23, 24, now it can all begin to show what the overall impact will be on the colleges. 22 is not listed here because 22 is even more interesting because of the step 3, half of it imposed, but then the community colleges also got a one-time offset. Again, not sustainable, but the cuts are. So that's why we wanted to show you this one, because this shows where we are right now and what we're looking at going into the next biennium. That state aid proportion is making a lower percentage, about 51%. Tuition, the increased tuition is in play because they did raise that tuition for this year. And you see it's getting close to about 27% of the cost. So looking at that multi-year chart, it's a lot of data. This series that we've taken you through helps you work through that analysis to see the 60-20-20 is quickly becoming closer to 51, 22, and about 27%. This is why I think we were tasked with the commission to do the sustainable funding work group that Joint Appropriations asked us to do.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Conley, I think that you did ask the question about what the colleges can do about more local revenue, but they're capped by statute. The statute says that they can assess, the board can assess 4, the board can assess an additional 1. All 7 colleges do that, but beyond that, it goes to a vote. So they cannot respond in any manner of expediency to a budget cut, for instance, what they're going to have. So like I said, the colleges were cut $22 million in step 2. They were cut another 9.8 in step 3. So they're taking a $20 or a $31 million reduction in state aid over that 2-year period. That's where we're at today. That's our reality.
Committee, any questions?
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Just quickly, has any board went to the public for a vote? Are they contemplating going to the public to try to get more mills?
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Summers, Laramie County Community College has been successful. They have, I think, the capacity at 5 mills. For
6 edition.
Yeah, and but the elected is the 5, right? So they, Laramie County Community College has been able to do that, but they created a very specific reason for that vote to do that rather than just a general fund offset. So I just want to recognize that we do have a college that has done that. They also don't have a BOCES for their dual and concurrent students. And they have used that for very specific projects.
So, Mr. Chairman, I think the answer is no then.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Summers, LCCC has, they do a 6th mill. It's earmarked. It's not for general operating.
That's right.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, just a quick follow-ups. But since we went into a budget crunch, has any board took the initiative to go to the public and see if the public will support community colleges at a greater rate? That's my question.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Summers, I don't think any of them have contemplated that action as of yet.
Let me follow up with a question on that. What's the timing of when you could go? Is it just a general election? Are there multiple times during the year you could go ask for another mill and If it's a special election, that's an expensive proposition in and of itself.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I don't have that right off the top of my head, but I would think it would just be during a general election. And it is only, it can only be, if it is voted in, it is imposed for a period of only 2 years, and then it expires. So it has to come back.
So committee, that is, I think, an important constraint. If you get hit as, say, if you were hit, the problem going to hit you this fall, you don't have an election to go to till next year. So it could be a longer term solution for a college, but you can't use it as a quick response to a budget cut that comes in the middle of your cycle. Even if you could go to a special election, I would think the cost of that would be prohibitive because those are not free. Okay. Go ahead, Mr. Chair.
See,
Back to the. So this really, it's getting to be a couple of years now that Joint Appropriations asked the Community College Commission to do a sustainable funding because they were aware of this challenge. They have us come every biennium and every supplemental to talk about this issue. And so I wanted to put this up in front of you because the design is the 60-20-20, but we're not at the 60-20-20. And as Co-Chairman Scott just mentioned, there are constraints in being able to exercise this additional mills via election. It really puts the only other mechanism on our community college students. And that creates quite a challenge. We do have in 21-17-102 the requirement to keep community college as free as possible, nearly as free as possible. The commission does have a tuition policy. They did enact that tuition policy to work as a framework, and it does put pressure to increase that tuition should the state aid go down. And you're seeing that occur. It actually does happen that way. And then what we work through in the sustainable funding is one, we're not at that 60-20-20. What other options could be on the table? So if we could go to the next slide. This is something that we did bring to your attention last in Saratoga in July, is what that translates to from 2010. And this is important because it does, the way the funding works for the community colleges, there is no external cost adjustment. So there is no consideration of the change of the value of a dollar. And that's a particularly challenging issue. So when you add that all up, comparative dollars from 2010 and the spending power the colleges have to where we are now, that equates to 94 million. When you add in the step 2 and the step 3 cuts, it's quite a significant amount of funding. So when you're hearing the colleges talk about that, and you see the pressure to increase that tuition, this really tells quite the story of the impact to the community colleges. We want to share with you, though, a little bit of where this 94 million exists, because that is something that we talked about in July, specifically the fixed costs, which you heard Mr. Buckles talk about in the allocation model. We have 60% of the state aid through the allocation model due to fixed cost. And then compensation that came up 3 times in the meeting in Saratoga. So we also calculated that. So we can explain a very significant part of where that 94 million exists and the challenge that creates to the colleges. So if we could go to the next slide. This is what we calculated. We got a strong sense from you last meeting in Saratoga. We needed to be able to explain where these costs are. And that's what we wanted to show you today. Fixed cost increases. And this is not all of the fixed costs. I want to be very clear on that. I had to check with them, make sure I wasn't telling you something incorrect. This is the amount of the cost for water, sewer, insurance, which insurance is very interesting right now when you have to have the additional things like cybersecurity insurance. What it costs just for motor pool. That change in direct costs since 2010 to 2019 was the last whole year we had, is $21 million in a biennium. That is a direct increase of cost to the colleges that is using more and more of that part of their budget.
Mr. Chairman, if I can, it was one point of clarification from what Dr. Caldwell just said. We have 2020 data. 2019 is not the last we have.
Oh.
We opted not to use 2020 because it's artificially low because of the pandemic. Students were on campus, faculty, staff wasn't on campus, electricity, all the utility bills are artificially low. Motor pool was low, nobody was traveling. So we opted not to use 2020 as a derivative of coming up with what's the real cost difference between what the colleges spent in 2010 to the last full year of operation 2019. That's what that $10 million figure is.
Thank you for fixing what I said.
Sorry.
And then the second part of that was a question that you all had for us in the meeting in Saratoga, and that is compensation. We did, and I use we, Mr. Buckles and the administrative vice presidents of the colleges did do the work on comparison pay for the community colleges, and they are low. They are below the national community colleges, particularly their faculty and their administrative staff they recruit nationally. So their comparative markets are a national employment base and competition with other community colleges and universities in terms of recruiting and hiring talent for the state of Wyoming's community colleges. So Mr. Buckles and the administrative vice presidents looked at two components. One is how much are they off just midpoint pay, the MPP, and then many of the college, well, I think all the colleges until this year, and that's because they were so far below, have not been able to award any sort of salary increases to keep them competitive across the country. So they also calculated what a 4% increase would be. They did a 1%, and then they looked at it 4%, particularly given the fact that the colleges have had to reduce staff so much and still maintain their services. So you have a lot of folks doing a lot of work. So we wanted to put this number together for you as well to really show where a large amount of this erosion of their budget is occurring. What's happening clearly is that out of that funding that they are getting, a larger percentage is having to go to fixed costs because they have to pay these bills. That creates less funding for student services, instruction. It stretches what they have to be expending those dollars on. And then in compensation, they are below. And that's why they're below, is because we are in that hole so much. Just in full transparency, that is what we included in our budget request. The commission did adopt that for submission in our budget because it was so clearly a part of what has occurred in that budget erosion, a higher proportion going to pay things like utilities, and the reality that the compensation at the colleges is below market. The next one. So this is one.
Mr. Co-Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, and stop me if you're going to get to this, but is there any interplay with federal funds here? this is, you've been talking state, and local, and the college's own funds. Is there a federal aid component that's of any significance that we need to pay attention to as well?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, Senator Scott, the federal funds that the community colleges do receive are not for general fund operations. They have, by and large, those occur for very specific purposes. TRIO grants, that would be the upward bound type of things. The TRIO grants. Those types of things where they receive funds to be used for this specific purpose. So the calculations, for example, if there's any staff associated with that, are not included in the general fund and how they use that general fund. So to answer your direct question, some of the colleges do receive some federal funding. It cannot be used to support general operations. They have to be used for specific purposes.
You weren't eligible for any or get any of the COVID relief funds for temporary relief?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, we actually did provide that documentation for you. The colleges did receive direct funding under the Higher Education Emergency Relief Funds through CARES, CRISA, and ARP. Those funds, again, have to be specifically used for mitigation of COVID, and the needs of the colleges exceeded the amount of funding that they did receive. And we did provide a report for you on that. And those funds could not be used for general operations. Okay. So we wanted to illustrate where the slide of the support for the colleges, the limitations that they have on increasing funds. As Chairman Scott just mentioned, Co-Chair Scott mentioned, there's some challenges on the additional mills that can be done by election, really puts the pressure on the tuition. And again, we have that boundary in the statutes. So through the work that the Joint Appropriations asked the Community College Commission to do, we did have a work group and they did really amazing work. We had SHIO, State Higher Education Executive Officers Organization, and WICHE, the Western Interstate Commission of Higher Education, facilitate this process because we knew that they had the expertise and the objectivity to help us through that process. We did have some guiding principles because we knew that was going to be important. What I really want to share with you is we looked at an entire menu of options. So what came forward on the recommendations were not intended ever to be prescriptive. They were considerations of how the legislative body might want to choose that. So we do have the potential in there for the mill levy increases, whether that be at the 4 mil, potentially raise that to 5 mil, the state mill. Larry's going to go through some numbers that you could consider.
Yes, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So I want to get this straight in my head again. I apologize. So you get 4 mills, right? And then does the boards of the community colleges each able to assess another mill? So when you talk about 4 mills, really you got 5 mills. You have authority for 5 mills.
Right.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Summers, you are correct. There is the required 4 mil. There is the optional 5th mil. All 7 of the community college districts that are eligible for state aid assess all of those. And that is reflected in the charts that we shared. So we made sure it includes the 4 mills and the optional 5th mill, but those are restricted. So at the community colleges, they have to assess 4 mills in order to receive state funding. They all assess the additional mill. There is no provision to increase that aside from a vote. That's a boundary. It is an exact amount. There is no 4, could be 5. The additional optional meal is 1. Could that be 2? So the Sustainable Funding Work Group contemplated all of those things to consider so that the legislature would have a good set of options to consider. Not any one of them, but how they all might combine together.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman.
Follow up.
Follow up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I look at these charts that you provided, and they all say 4 mills. But do they really mean the 5 mills and not the 4 mills? Because I'm trying to figure out how much money y'all get in mills.
Mr. Chairman, and if I can have the slide come back up, and then we will go back. It's actually on there. I even separated that out. I see how I did that, Mr. Buckles, Larry, separated that out. So if we could go back to those charts right here, there's a good example. So what we did is we broke that out. We've got mills and local revenue is the 22.4%, but it's the 2 blocks together. So the dark blue, the darkest blue represents the 4. The next lighter blue to the left going up is then the 1 mill. And that also has some motor vehicle in there, Representative Summers. So we made sure to call that out. So it is considered together as the 20%. However, we wanted to break that out so that you could see how much was the 4, how much was the 1, and how much comes actually in from the motor vehicle. That helps.
And Mr. Chairman, Representative Summers, if you were to go back to that year by year by year,
On here.
it's part of the, there's a link in the agenda for that. It separates it out. What's 4 mil, what's 1 mil, what's motor vehicle.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. We anticipated that might be a question, so we made sure to illustrate how much of the mills. So you're right, it's 5 mills. We showed how much was 4 and how much is the optional 1, so that you could see how they work together. Okay, and now if we can go on to back to this one. So we looked at a whole menu of options. One of those that's on there is the sales and use tax. I just want to reiterate that we're not necessarily recommending that. It is one of the options you have before you. You have many options and lots of ones that we looked at through multiple states. So if we can go to the next slide, I would like to turn this over to Ms. Taylor. She was a part of that Sustainable Funding Work Group, and she put together a fantastic chart that looked at everything. Of course, our task was to distill it down to make recommendations. However, we looked at all aspects, and I've got to commend Ms. Taylor because she really did a great amount of work so that we could review these different options. So if we could go to that link and start it, I think it's page 24. Now I'm having a moment where I think it's page 25, but if that's possible, we'll have Ms. Taylor go through that.
Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, sorry, one last question on the mill deal. So your optional 5th mill, is that forever and always when a board approves of it, or is that got to be every 2 years they got to re-up it? Every 2 years they got to re-up it.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Summers, that's a 2-year option also.
Follow up on that one, Mr. Chairman. And is it true that that's always been successful?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Connolly, that is a board action.
And again, it's always been successful.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Connolly, yes.
So Mr. Chairman, if I may, from the introduction from Dr. Caldwell, the chart that you see before you really was a deep dive. This was in addition, there were so many folks working on the sustainable funding issues, the legislative committee within the Wyoming Community College Commission, WACD folks were working on this. So really we were trying to think of everything, put everything on the table. What are all of the options that we have before you, given the current tax structure, given the limitations in statute, et cetera. And so the chart that you have in front of you does outline what those things are, including what the commission recommendations included. But there are some other ideas on here that are non-tax, if you will, allowing more flexibility in statute. Oh, sure.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, it is in the comprehensive sustainable funding document that we gave you. And if you'll head to pages 24, 25, and 26, you will find it there. Thank you, Representative Connolly.
Are you feel okay? Thanks. So I was just talking about how this included other ideas, including non-district counties imposing mills, talking about out-of-district tuition. It also looks at those other mill levies and the time frame by which they, how long they can be imposed. Because you heard earlier from Mr. Buckholtz, I almost promoted you to a doctorate. You know how long they can be imposed. 2 years isn't often enough time to run a campaign like that in your public and actually be able to utilize that money before the timeframes run out. So allowing a longer time frame for something like that, or perhaps allowing an additional mill that the board could impose without a vote might be another tool as well. So, you know, what I also wanted to say that Dr. Caldwell hasn't expressed to you is the conversations with our industry partners were so important in this entire process. Recognizing the environment that our industry partners are in right now, they will tell you, they've told us, we absolutely support the community colleges, but we can't take another tax increase or another mill on our backs, right? We all hear that and we all know that. So it's just putting us in a tricky position because they do support the community colleges, but they're in a tough spot as well. So that's why we wanted to include a really comprehensive menu of ideas that also included things that weren't tax increase ideas. So just to give you a little bit of background for that and the work that went into this, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, we can go back and then we'll talk a little bit more about where we sort of landed, but based in the work of the menu of options. So if we can head back to the presentation, and then Mr. Buckles will talk a little bit about how things, what the numbers already are. So this, when the Community College Commission, the work group, which consisted of commissioner, staff, trustees, college presidents, Ms. Taylor, I'm trying to think who else is on there, really got to work with the guidance of Witchy and Shio, who have the expertise, and they have what occurs at each one of the states and how that can come together. So the total budget need was based on, if we looked at 2010, we filled that $94 million hole that we have, including those consideration of the increase in fixed cost and compensation. That's where we landed. But part of the task that appropriations wanted us to look at is how could the proportion become lower on the state aid and higher on other components. So that's why you sort of see a 1 and a 2 in this situation. It was right now it's supposed to be, or it's designed. I want to say supposed to be, it's not accurate. It's designed to be at 60%. If we could get to a fully funded system compared to 2010, we could, if there are other levers pushed, it could lower that obligation on the general fund at 45%. We're about looking in the next biennium at about 51% on that. So these were not intended to be rigid, but we had to bring something that said, here's all of this information. Here are some consideration of some options. And then it also had this opportunity to fund this other portion off the state aid in a couple of different mechanisms. Any one of these could be like prong 1 and prong 2. You could just do prong 1 more. You could do not prong to it all. I mean, they're designed to give the legislature some options to look at on how you might do that, because you have a lot of things that you need to, that you're considering. That's why it says ad valorem in the form of some amount of mill. Maybe that's a mill statewide. Maybe that's to allow the local districts an additional optional mill. Maybe that's to increase the 4 mill to 5 mills. There's options for you to consider there. And then should you choose to go with something like a penny sales tax, or that you have an endowment consideration, for example, of today, it would be some portion of it, not, of course, not all of it, because you have a lot of, again, a lot of needs, but this does not try to indicate that it should come from these two. It could come from any combination or not at all. So that's something to consider. And then if we can go to the next slide, then Mr. Buckles can share with you what that looks like statewide when you look at those amounts, but also what we know we're looking at in terms of assessed valuation in the next year.
Thank you, Dr. Caldwell. Mr. Chairman. This slide kind of lays out the work that we did last year and is based on facts that we knew last year. The bottom part of the slide does add a caveat into what we now know about 2021 and what's going on around the state of Wyoming as far as assessed valuations are concerned. The initial work again shows that if we were to impose a simple 1 mill across all 23 counties and direct that revenue to the colleges, it'd be about $45 million a biennium. Split out, that's an additional $16 million from the 7 counties that have a college and $29 million from the 16 counties that do not have a college. We've talked about this before, specifically Representative Summers has talked about this before. All 23 counties benefit from the 7, now 8 community colleges in the system. 16 of those counties, now 15, do not pay to support them by way of general operating costs. Our colleges have a presence in every single county. They have faculty, they're teaching classes, they're supporting the high school faculty that teach concurrent classes. It's happening all throughout the state, but 15 of those counties right now don't pay anything to support the system. So there's an opportunity there. And that's what that opportunity in the form of a 1 mill across those. And this would have to be adjusted because this was done before the Campbell County vote. There's an opportunity to get some income to sustain college operations across the system. A 1 penny sales tax, I think you all have seen this. This is analysis that was done by LSO staff last year. 1 penny generates about $323 million a biennium, $160 million a year. In a conversation yesterday evening with Senator Ellis, yes, it does. But the legislature doesn't like the earmark money. We wouldn't want it all. We'd only take a portion of it, but getting an earmark is not the flavor of the day. And if it comes into the general fund, K-12 is going to suck up every dime of it anyway. Could potentially, right? But again, we get to this caveat on the bottom of this slide. From last year to this year, assessed valuations across the state of Wyoming are down 15.52% across the system, across the 23 counties. We're down. In simple 1 mill for the 16 non-tax counties right now, that's $2 million a year. So if we had that in place, if we had a mill for those 16 counties, we would see a revenue decrease $2 million in 1 year. Where we do have 4 mills across the 7 taxing districts, over the course of 1 year, we're going to lose $3.5 million in revenue for 1 year in the system. The colleges are already taking a $31 million hit. Now they're going to take another hit in local revenue in the same year. This is for fiscal year 22 for the colleges, the second year of our budget. So again, we talked about this, ebbs and flows, just like the rest of our economy. Property valuations do the same thing. And we have to adjust, and there's no way to respond to it in any quick way. If we could impose something that gets us to a level of sustainability, we can work through those things. We worked through a $31 million budget cut. We can work through a couple of $1 million fluctuation in local revenue from local mills without too much heartache. There's always going to be heartache. But that just kind of gives you a picture of how things work and how we have to react to it. You're faced with the same thing in K-12, right? All that revenue that is assessed in the form of millage for K-12, which I think is in the neighborhood of about 74 mil in each county that goes to K-12. Colleges are supported by 5. Thank you, Representative Harshman. Yeah.
Okay, what I wanted to put before you on this one, I wanted to also answer a couple of questions that some of them we talked about already with the Hathaway discussion that we had. I just wanted to share again, the Community College Commission did submit through the process out of the governor's office our ARPA requests. We did that for the colleges, for the commission, and for the attainment work. We've now been asked to move that forward to the drive stage. That's due in October. You might have seen that published today. So we'll be moving that forward to really work on how we can do some of the transformative work for the community colleges, but also do some of the things that are of desperate need. For example, cybersecurity at the colleges. This is a challenge for us. We need some funding to do that. Because that is a hard one for them to do on the add-on. Safety and security at the institutions that definitely became highlighted during this last year of the pandemic. And then things like one of the bills you have up right now, and that's the Wyoming's Tomorrow. And recognizing how powerful and important that is for students in the state to be able to attend, which is one of the challenges that we have. So we'll be working on those next stages of what those requests will be. And there'll be public information, as we'll have them on our commission meeting in October, and they go in, I think, October 8th or 9th. And then the last thing that I wanted to put on here are some of the details that we talked about during the Hathaway that I'd already brought up. And that's what we're seeing in the America's College Promise. And for co-chairman Senator Scott, this has some of the details that we're watching very closely on what that legislation is going to look like. That's why we want to make sure that anything that you have the information on how best to leverage these federal funds as you're contemplating these 2 draft bills today. So we do know that the free community college, that's why I was bringing up the $1,800 per semester for a full-time student on the average. What we do know, it is going to be first dollar, doesn't compete with statewide first dollar. So it lets them both occur, which is a great, because it does allow that last dollar funding to work up to the total cost of attendance. And that was one of the focus areas that we did hear from them. It's going to be time-based towards sufficient credits. They do want to see increasing transfer. They're going to, one of the things that's in there is to really try to consider completion as not only completion of an associate degree or a certificate, but that they successfully transfer to a completion of a bachelor's degree. And that is within that. The match focus, so it's a 10-year time horizon on this College Promise, regardless of which bill it lands in. But they do anticipate those funding, states using the funding, they will fund up to 75% for the first 3 years to allow states to build up their corpus so that they could have more long-term sustainability with things like endowments that they know states are working on. They're very interested in Wyoming. Wyoming has a very unique approach to how it administers endowment funds and uses not only the investment account, the reserve account and the expenditure account in ways that allow for really long-term sustainability. They're very interested in Wyoming in that they are looking at a median tuition basis. That actually helps Wyoming, which is an interesting concept. There is a maintenance of effort requirement, and that is a little different than what we've seen on the maintenance of effort, maintenance of equity. We already know that our community colleges have the most disproportionately impacted students, and our community colleges are actually quite successful and number one, number two in the country in terms of the performance of our community colleges in the state of Wyoming. So we've really been tracking this information. We want to make sure whatever you do move forward on endowments, you have what you need, and we're really trying to watch that for you. Yes.
Mr. Chairman, you just got my attention on maintenance of effort. We have found those to be very dangerous in a number of other programs. And that is one thing that could cause legislatures to say, no, you can't take it. What are they actually proposing? Because we can see those getting us in real trouble in places.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, Senator Scott, this maintenance of effort, maintenance of equity is quite different from what is seen in the relief funds that ties K-12 funding to funding at the post-secondary institutions. What is designed in this one, we'll see how it finally comes out, but it's actually on support for students at funding at the community college level. So it's an interesting concept. This is student focused rather than institutional funding focused. So it is designed so that the state builds up their endowment corpus, however they're structured in that state, so that it can continue to fund those students as time goes by, so it doesn't get artificially dropped. So that's a 10-year timeframe that they will be looking. After that 10-year timeframe, that will not be done. The good thing is that they are looking to pay 75% of that in the first 3 years. It's different.
Follow
So if and you know, we're talking speculation here because goodness knows what they're ultimately going to do.
That's right.
If anything. If we use that funding to create an endowment, say, that would go to the students, would their maintenance of effort be such that that would preclude us from having further reductions in the state aid or force us to do a tax increase?
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, Senator Scott, right now, the answer is no, because it's structured differently. It's maintenance of effort on the amount of the funds, creating free community college tuition and fees. That's that 1,800, and that extend throughout that period rather than the funding at the institutions and the state aid. It's different. So it's a measurement on support to students, not support to the institutions.
So far, enrollments went up, we would then be forced to increase the budget to meet that maintenance effort per student, or is it total or on a per student basis?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, Senator Scott. This is an important question that I need to be able to answer, and it's one I'm going to ask, actually. The way that I understand it is the reserve account should help in the structure of that based on what we can project enrollments are going to be coming forward between the adult population and our traditional college age students. I think we would at least have some snapshot of that, but I need to ask that question. If we were to suddenly grow and it doesn't have enough to fund during the 10-year timeframe, just also keep in mind it's during that 10-year timeframe. I need to ask that question, but right now I think that may be managed through the structure of the reserve account that's in that current bill right now.
Mr. Chairman, we are talking speculative things here. And we'll have to see when they really do. The point I want to make to them, as you all are talking about, we're starting to get quite concerned that the state government is deprived of their ability to manage their own budgets. And we're going to have to start pushing back on that. I think we're going to have to start saying no to it. Because otherwise we're going to get in a situation where our tax rate is dictated by Washington, D.C. I don't think that's all.
Mr. Chairman, we'll keep you apprised as this moves forward. This is a question I'm going to ask because this is an important question. I also wanted to point out two things that are embedded in the work that's going on right now with the College Promise. One of those is a completion grant focused on support for learners. And that is recognizing that the completion agenda is more than the funding for the students to attend. It is to ensure that the services are wrapped around the student to support them. We don't have a great deal of information on this one. It is one of the areas that we want to explore to see if there are options for our colleges to be able to access some of those funds. And then the last thing that we're also watching is this debate that's going on the consideration of doubling the Pell amount. And that's going to get closer to the total cost of attendance, whether that be at a community college or the university. So we're watching that one very closely. One of the questions we ask is, could that potentially supplant, and can that be used along with the community college, the free community college? And the answer that we got was that the intent is that it allows you to leverage the resources to benefit the students in the best possible way. So that's actually an interesting concept that they had. We don't know yet how that might come out, but we wanted to make sure that you were aware because that could also help funding go quite a long way for the student grants.
Yes, Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So will you guys be back to provide comment on the two bill drafts as we go through them?
Mr. Chairman, we will.
Yes, we will. And Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, and members of the committee, that really is a lot of information we have shared with you today. And we are happy to answer any questions. We know you have two bills that we certainly address much of the information that we talked about today. So we're happy to answer any questions, and I think we're wrapped up.
Mr. Co-Chair.
Mr. Chairman, not a question. I just want to compliment you. This has been an extraordinarily useful presentation, particularly to those of us who are new to this committee or haven't been on it for quite some time, as in my case. You know, I have a much better understanding now of how the community colleges are funded, how it all works. And so I just wanted to extend my compliments. And it's going to be very useful for us understanding what we're dealing with going forward.
I would echo that. Any other questions? Comments? All right, thank you. Looks like the next item on our agenda is a consideration of draft legislation 22 LSO 0108, Wyoming Community College Investment Fund. Tanya, are you ready to present to us?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, this bill was requested at your July meeting and it creates the Wyoming Community College Investment Fund with an initial allocation of $100 million and a permanent fund. You'll note at the end of the bill, the identification of the source of those funds needs to be identified. We'll go ahead and walk through the bill now. Beginning on page 2, it creates the statutory scheme for this particular program. Page 2, lines 5 through 11, creates the income account to be comprised of the investment earnings from the investment fund and including any legislative appropriations. I would point out on page 10, or excuse me, line 10, page 2, after distributed, the state treasurer's office asked that we bring a technical amendment to your consideration that would read by the state treasurer. So it would say shall be distributed by the state treasurer on a quarterly basis. Moving on, lines 13 through 15 allocates 50% of that amount to a community college state aid expenditure account, which is created later in the bill, and 50% to a community college special projects expenditure account, also created later in the bill. You can see that on the bottom of page 2, lines 22 through 23, and on to page 3, lines 1 through 3. That is the creation of the state aid expenditure account, creation of the special projects expenditure account can be found on page 3, lines 5 through 10. Moving on, page 3, lines 12 onto page 4, line 2. Those are the reporting requirements to the JEC and to the Select Cap Finance Select Committee of the Wyoming Legislature. Also talks about the investment of the funds as well as the allocation to the expenditure accounts. Moving on to page 4, section 2 modifies the permanent funds scheme to include this Wyoming Community College Investment Fund, which would consist of the funds appropriated and also any gift. It would be subject to the Wyoming Constitution, Article 15, Section 20, and be designated as a permanent fund. That can be found on page 4, lines 13 through 21. On page 5, lines 11 and 12, that's a conforming amendment in 94714. And then on page 5, lines 14 through 17, this is the appropriation that I mentioned, and you'll notice a staff comment that designates that we need an identification for the source of the corpus of the fund for the corpus of the account. The effective date of this act is July 1st of 2022. You can find that on page 6, line 6. Subject to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And my question really is, so it's kind of like the Wildlife Trust Fund. We're going to spend every dime of revenue. There is no reserve, no way to really grow the corpus with this amount.
That's correct. It's subject to appropriation by the legislature, both of those two accounts that are created.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, other questions, comments?
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. You know, when I made this motion, and I still believe in it, is we're going to have the opportunity, and I sent everybody a diagram, I think, that's in appropriations right now, and it shows kind of some of the money that's going to become available, and it's expected that in revenue replacement, we will probably have the ability through the next biennium and what we have now to have about $502 million available that we might be able to use for endowments or permanent funds or whatever I think the legislature might choose to do. I'm not married to anything in here other than the idea that I think there's a real need in the community colleges to have some additional money. I believe we're going to have some money from the federal government. And I think it would be a shame if we don't try to start something that could help fund community colleges that's not really going to affect the taxpayer. And so I think this is just a method. I'm not married on the 50-50. I made that motion. The idea was originally, some to the block grant. We did the Wyoming Works program a while back that had a programmatic piece, which is related to workforce. We could do something like that. We could put it all into the block grant. It was just a matter of whether we wanted to direct a piece of it to specific programmatic stuff like workforce development, different kinds of workforce development. So, Mr. Chairman, that's the reason I certainly made that motion, and I just hope we will take a look at it and see how we could refine it. And my intent, and certainly that revenue replacement dollars ultimately will be general fund, but I certainly would want language that tied it to that pot of money that will be created through that revenue replacement. And so, Mr. Chairman, thank you for that.
Okay, other comments from the committee? Questions?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Co-Chair.
Let me say a general proposition on this. I think that it is a good idea to pass this bill to get us prepared so that we can take care of opportunities either from the federal side or from if the vagaries of the interaction between the current national administration and the price of our oil and gas produces as a windfall, to be prepared to use this to solve some of the problems long term. So, Mr. Chairman, I think we ought to go forward with the bill. I'm going to suggest that I want a way that we can, if we take federal money, we can keep it where we can get at it temporarily before we put it into the permanent fund to make sure we fully understand what the feds have put strings on it. Because we've seen some tendency for them to have you take the money first and then tell you what you got to do with it. And I think it might be handy to have that available. And I'm just starting to realize the need for that, listening to the presentation we just heard, Mr. Chairman. So I want some time to think out how that is best achieved. I think maybe we ought to have a provision we can put it in one of these accounts that's described here without having to spend it until there is some appropriation and be able to keep it there for a little while. I want to review this to see if the existing language does that or we need to add something. Mr. Chairman, I also wonder if maybe the best approach would be on the appropriation. You ask for 100 million, you almost guarantee you're not going to get more than that. You may jeopardize getting the 2/3 to get it introduced, because there'd be people that are after this pot of money for other things. I wonder if the better strategy would be to leave an appropriation in, but to make it nominal, so that that's something to be settled in negotiation during the session. And I'm throwing that out as a couple of ideas that I think we need to consider in this bill.
Okay. Other comments, questions from the committee?
Mr. Chairman.
Yes,
I
Representative
think
Hart.
Chairman Scott, I think, is right on. And I think there's probably a couple ways to kind of add to this. I think you create a reserve account in this bill because I think you want it to grow. And I think the Wildlife Trust Fund, when we fully fund that thing, I think we ought to do a little work on that as well. But I think, you could set up a reserve account to hold these funds until 2025 or 2026. And if they tip, and then set a spending policy at 5% and let this thing roll, and it'll grow. I mean, it won't stay at 100 million. It'll keep growing, and that's really what we want to try to do. And now I probably won't keep up with inflation and do all that, but a little growth is better than no growth, and we'll have those years. So I think that's all fixable, and I think that's good counsel by Senator Scott on that.
Yes, Senator
I
Scott.
want to suggest one other thing to think about. If we took that approach that Representative Hartman just suggested, how about authorizing use of some of the funds to be used as a 50-50 match for community colleges that use that to raise funds locally? So, and do it, we done that successfully with the University of Wyoming, but I think we've done it aimed at very large donors, and I'm thinking of aiming it much more at smaller donors, such that you could raise money for your local community college. And that would give the college presidents some opportunities to be very creative in doing some local fundraising that would match things.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I think if you go down that route, then that one, and the percentages don't matter, but if you got two pots of money, one could be to the block grant, one could be to a matching account. And then as money rolls into that matching account, then community colleges could match that however you wanted that match to be, and then it would flow to them in order to get it. So you could do that, certainly.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Conley.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, just a couple of things. First, I will definitely kind of support the bill, and I wanted to thank the commission and Ms. Taylor for their presentation. I also want to point out, I think differently about federal money than Senator Scott, and that's okay. But that that there's not a unified position here. Honestly, I look at it as opportunities for our citizens and our constituents. I want to look at any maintenance requirements, but there are opportunities out there, and I want to maximize opportunities in the state. That's for sure. That's the number one priority on my mind. When I look at this bill, I think of, honestly, that placeholder of $100 million indicates, honestly, a need that we heard from actually Ms. Taylor and your chart, and the recognition that we are not going to pass, I think, an additional mill levy for the community colleges, and more likely than not, we are not going to pass anything that requires counties that aren't paying in to contribute. It's just not going to happen. We've been down those roads. We've talked about it both openly and behind closed doors. It's probably not going to happen. You know what else isn't going to happen? We're probably not going to close a community college. I sat here thinking, you know what you don't have down here is closing a community college. But the reality is we're probably not going down there. But we know that we want our community colleges, we want them to do well, and that there is a funding shortage right now for them to do the job that we expect them to do. There's federal money that's available for us that we can put into endowment type accounts. This is a good way to utilize that money. So I'm in favor of the bill. I'm in favor of the $100 million as the placeholder rather than zero, right? In some ways, go one or the other, either go zero or 100 million, but 100 million in some ways indicates what the need is. The one thing I would change the percentages. Honestly, the 50% that's allocated for special projects, to me, could indicate that there's the ability for fluff. And that's not what we're hearing at all, that what is really needed is a sustained funding for the block grant. And so I might argue to up it to 75-25 and then do part of the 25 is for matching. But again, I agree with Representative Summers. Those are just details, policy details. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, any other comments before we open it up to public comment? Okay, open for public comment.
Mr. Chairman, again, my name is Erin Taylor, representing the Wyoming Association of Community College Trustees. Obviously, you know the community colleges support this bill. Our top priority in the legislative space for several years now has been sustainable funding, period. So just like you heard from some of the members on your committee, there's an opportunity before us right now. In Wyoming, we know how to do endowments. We know how to work our accounts, our reserve accounts. We know how to do this, so we don't have to reinvent any wheels with this. And if we can use this in a way that can benefit the community colleges, it is a non-tax option. It does provide some stability for years and years to come. This is something that we would absolutely get behind. Dr. Caldwell does have some suggestions for you, and some of the ideas were already brought up, but she just has a few tweaks in the bill that she'd like to extend to the committee, if that's all right with you, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, please.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, members of the committee, I'm Sandy Caldwell, Executive Director of the Wyoming Community College Commission. In our review of this bill, this is, of course, addressing the sustainable funding that we have been talking about for quite some time. Mr. Buckles and I, and Ms. Taylor and I, we've really gone through. We had just very minimal comments and some suggestions for you, because much of what we've discussed and talked about, you've already discussed and talked about, and we know that we'll work through that process and just some consideration. So if I can just hit very quickly on the page 2, it's the percentages. It's definitely what we're looking at. We do think a higher percentage for the state aid and a lower percentage for the special projects. Special projects, of course, very important. They tend to happen fairly cyclically. The need for that state aid is constant. And so whether that's 75, 25, 80, 20, that is really the number we were looking at, was around the 80-20 based on our own experience, particularly on the special projects through the work that we did with Wyoming Works and how that could potentially work. So we sort of landed on that as well, but any of those ranges would be certainly an advantage to that. And then there's a couple of places we only want to suggest maybe some additional language, because we do have administrative rules in which we can administer. We already have an allocation model, as you saw with that. So on page 2, line 23.
I have a question on the first suggestion.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, my question is, should we fix in statute a 75-25 or 80-20 rule? Or should we put that in as a default rule and allow that explicitly to be varied in the budget bill? So it would be something that would give us a good deal more flexibility, so that in a year where things really were pretty good, we could do more for special projects. And a year when they're very tight, we could go the other way. And I think we could allow that as a regular part of the budget bill, so it wouldn't be seen as legislating in the budget, rather than put a fixed figure in the statute at this point.
Mr. Chairman.
Comments? Yes.
Yeah, and in support of that idea, and I think you just list those 3 things: general budget operations, special projects, matching funds. And then future legislator says, might be 100% that year for special projects. Might be in a boom and you got a match going, who knows? So.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman and Co-Chairman Senator Scott, that was actually one of the conversations that we had as well. That we were sort of working with what was in front of us, but that was actually an option that we discussed as well, to provide some flexibility, particularly in undetermined years. It's hard to read the future, and this gives them flexibility. So that is one. One that we had is on line page 2, line 23. And this one says account shall only be expended upon legislative appropriation. And then our suggestion here is and administered by commission rule, because we do have the administrative rules and the allocation model through which we have a mechanism, and we would like to make sure that's reflected there.
Good.
And then parallel to that is on page 3, line 7. The same thing. After expended upon legislative appropriation, we would suggest language that says and administered by commission rule.
Okay. That it?
Mr. Chairman, Larry Buckles, CFO at the Community College Commission. I would just put a bug in your ear. If you're going to tip, if the intention is to tip any part of this to an endowment challenge, it's not addressed in the current bill. And if you are, we need to contemplate each college's ability to match. I would encourage you to not take whatever the tip is and divide it by 7. It's not equitable. So I just want to put that bug in your ear.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So I'm torn a little bit on the idea of great flexibility for future legislators to decide what that percentage is versus nailing the percentage kind of down. It's more sellable, I think, now if you have the percentages down for this legislature versus, given that flexibility to future legislators. So, what's your preference? I mean, I just want to, we may not take your preference, but I just soon hear what you all think is the better route to go on how we split and what we split it into. If it's more than 2, if it's 3, what do you want to see? And then we'll debate it and all, and we might not take any of your advice, but at least I want to know.
Go ahead. Need some consultation time there.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Representative Summers, I think we want to model it out a little bit and look. I would tell you that in many respects, the 80-20, because I do think it is desirable right now. We have a high interest in this moving forward. We don't want something that's going to stop it. I think that's an important consideration. Having some ability to help fund the colleges and to provide some programmatic funding is critically important. If that helps, that is, I think, something that makes that a preference. That said, having flexibility for a time period where we may not be able to fully project that right now is also desirable. And that's why that's a challenge for us to really give you a hard and fast. I think under the prevailing conditions, the 80-20 might have the success of moving forward at this point. But certainly the opportunity for matching is very powerful. And we know that creates support and buy-in at the local level. So that's why it's so hard. I know I didn't answer your question very directly, but under the current situation, that 80-20 might help this successfully move forward. Mr. Buckles probably disagrees with me.
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Taylor, you've been around the legislature longer than I have. So tell me what your thoughts are on this. Just gut feeling on the deal, how you would like to see it.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Summers, to clarify, are you asking specifically about the percentage? We've seen through the Appropriations Committee, we've seen them offer the ability to provide matching and things like that over the years. Some folks are able to do that better than others. You know, we see how that works. I kind of tend to agree that for now, I think the 80-20 is probably where it's best. That's something we can always change in the future, you know, if there's a real want for something like the matching. But I would love to reserve the ability to talk to all of the colleges about that as well. And maybe that's something we can come back to in November with a little bit more feedback and thought behind it from everyone that would be involved, if that's fair to ask that.
Mr. Co-Chairman.
Following up on that, when you talk to the other colleges, ask them if we were to put in an 80-20 as the default provision in the original provision, and then allow it to be varied in the budget bill, would that be something that they would find useful?
Okay,
Mr. Chairman, can I weigh in?
go ahead.
The conversation morphs a little bit in that I need to understand the entire picture. Are we talking about 80% of 50% of the earnings? Are we talking about taking 50% and putting it into a reserve account, distributing the other 50% based on some kind of a distribution model, 80-20, 80-10-10, if some of it's going to go to an endowment challenge? The conversation changes, because if we're only getting 20% of 50% for programs, special projects, that's now just $500,000 a year. That doesn't move the needle. I think we need to understand exactly what we're talking about. The potential is 10% earnings or 5% earnings on a $100 million endowment, $5 million a year. Are we going to distribute 5 million? We're going to distribute 2.5. Of that 2.5, are now we talking 80% of that to state aid, some percentage to special project. It changes it morphs the conversation. We need to know that we're going to move the needle. The amount that we get can't be so small that it does us no good. We can't fully fund a special project with $500,000 a year at any one institution. So I think we need, and I understand your trepidation. I also think that if you do this in the form of a 300 section footnote in the budget, and you lay those percentages out, you create a precedent. It's very easy to change that in the future, but the precedent's created, and it allows that flexibility, even though you may not like it, for future legislators, legislatures, to continue to massage that and make it work to the best advantage to the institutions.
Mr. Co-Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, and I'm not 100% sure I understood the question, but as I've understood the conversation, we were talking about taking all the income from the permanent endowment. And as the bill's written, I read it, half goes to special projects and half goes to as what I was understanding was you want to change that to 80% goes to the spending on current operations and 20% to the special projects. And I think that's what we're talking about. I see the need to create a reserve account to temporarily handle federal money while we're sorting out what do they really require us to do and can we live with it. That's a different proposition. But I was frankly thinking on this one, instead of having some of the complicated formulas we've got, that this was the way to do it.
Okay, clear on that? Yes. Aaron, go ahead.
And Mr. Chairman, just to kind of add on to this a little bit, what came to my mind, particularly to your question, Representative Summers, is that whatever is done, it should really be set up so that it's that automatic flow. It's distributed by a model we already have that's in the commission. It just can't become a fighting it out every legislative session. If I can be, that's just what we're really trying to avoid, that situation where parts of the state are against other parts because they need this or that there's a process established in the commission, and that wouldn't happen in the legislative space. That's what I think would be really important to make sure it moves forward.
Chairman.
Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I agree. So on part B, at least I agree. I don't know if anybody else does. There is created the Community College State Aid Expenditure Account. Funds within the account shall only be, it says now, be expended upon legislative appropriation. But we can say, of course, all state aid is expended upon a further legislative appropriation. So I think we're still okay because that's the intent. And so it would flow on. And then if we put in here as administered by the commission rule, but even current state aid is is upon further legislative appropriation. So I think we're okay.
Okay, Representative Harshman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I, sorry I had to step out deal, but I think, this would be a pretty easy. I think what you want though is a more of an assurance. That's the beauty of a spending policy. That there's a 5% spend, and when you go to budget, 5% of 105 million, you know what that number is, 5% of 110 million. And so if you just go on, this expenditure account, this thing could be 0 to 15%, or who knows? And so I think the idea then is to grow this over time. This can be, the concept amendment is really to add the paragraph B. It has the expenditure account. We just need the reserve account, or we combine these kind of together. But the idea is a spending policy, 5%, a reserve amount of 6 or 9%, whatever, 4.5%, 6%, and then let the excess flow on. When we have that, let it flow to build the corpus to generate more income. I just really think and that'll give you more assurance in the future. And, and it has nothing to do with this 80-20 or any of that. It's just setting up an endowment model, not just a spend it all model.
Yes, Co-Chairman.
Want to ask a question of Representative Harshman. With your concept, would it work? The place where the uncertainty in our revenues from an endowment really comes in is in the capital gains area, where we get that once a year. We don't profile it. What would happen if we structured the thing such that all the money from interest and dividends was distributed for spending right away? And then we took the capital gains and for a period dedicated those earnings to half go to the spend it right away and half go to a reserve account until we reach some kind of amount. Would that be a feasible way to manage this thing?
Representative Harshman.
Mr. Chairman, and there's probably a lot of ways to slice this. I think the question for you guys, though, this is continuously appropriate. You don't really need the money like that. I mean, you need budget money, and you set a budget and you get your state money, and this would be more state money in it. How many payments do you get of state money a year? I can't remember. It's not in one lump sum. As you get a couple payments throughout the year of state aid, 4 payments quarterly. Yeah. And I mean, so however we do it, I think that's doable. It's probably getting a little late to flesh all it out. Maybe we can get the brain trust on this deal, the LSO staff, and maybe some of you who are interested can work as a little working group. Some of you, I'll certainly help if you want, but I just think the idea though of an endowment to grow the corpus, I think that's where everybody's nodding yes on that deal, and I think we can figure it out. So thank you.
Yes, go ahead.
I would volunteer to participate as part of the ones to work with the LSO. But I would hope to get somebody else to join in.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I wrote it. I'm tired of these endowment models. So I'm certainly willing to vote for it, but I'm going to let somebody else work it out because I get tired of arguing about them.
Mr. Chairman,
I guess that was clear enough. Mr. Co-Chairman.
we do have an account.
That's right. Let's do the Casper curve and do it.
There you go.
There you go.
Felt that arm twist, didn't he? All right.
And Mr. Chairman, I would pledge, we've got a November meeting. We want to get a final bill in good shape. Before then, we'll have to get some ideas together and get to the LSO promptly.
Yeah, maybe a Zoom meeting somewhere or something like that.
Let's go,
Okay.
Casper.
All right.
And just-
Anything else from you folks? All right, then we still have people probably online that would like to testify. Anyone else in person would like to testify?
Actually, Mr. Chairman, we have no one online.
No one online? All of the presidents left us. I got tired of listening to us, I guess, huh?
And Mr. Chairman, by November, we should, and I certainly will work with the chairs or whoever to get the right language as far as the money and, where the money's going to come from. So work with our legislative staff to figure out if appropriations is going to create a fund or a pot of money or how we want to designate that. So I'll work on that as time goes on.
Okay, that sounds like a good idea. Are we ready to move the bill?
I think we're just going to let it slide.
Go to November.
Can we wait till November? Okay. Are we pretty clear, LSO folks, on all the projected amendments and you have enough direction now to give us a product that'll probably be changed 15 more times before we actually pass it? Or?
I think our working group will give us great direction on that. So.
Mr. Chairman, can
Yes.
we assume that the suggestion from the treasurer's office and the two and language additions from the Community College Commission, we'll ask for those right now to be included in the draft.
Mr. Chairman, we'll certainly include those.
And we'll take into account what they just told us as we work on this, the language and where the money goes. And use their suggestions as a basis.
Okay. Anything else on this particular item? Are we ready to move on? All right, what's the pleasure of the group? You want to take a quick break or are you ready to just keep rolling? Just keep rolling. Let's see. Okay, let's do it. Next item on the agenda is the Higher Education Adult Scholarship. This is consideration of draft legislation 22 LSO 0107. Education's Wyoming's Tomorrow Scholarship. Tanya, lead us through this, please.
Mr. Chairman, this is the last bill for today. It's a resurrection of House Bill 165 from the 2021 session. As you stated, it creates the Wyoming's Tomorrow Scholarship. Much of the language is patterned after the Hathaway Scholarship, the creation of the accounts and the eligibility requirements, whether different. You'll notice that the organization of the bill is very similar.
Question.
Representative Summers.
So, Mr. Chairman, I'm sure you will, Tanya, but when we get to the part, is it going to be exactly like the Hathaway account as far as the money flow? And if it's not, you'll highlight those differences as we go.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Summers, currently it's structured exactly like the Hathaway Scholarship.
That's what I thought. Thank you.
Okay, proceed.
The definitions beginning on page 2, line 2 through page 4 Line 6, those are the definitions as utilized throughout the act. Moving on to page 4, lines 8 through 23. This is the actual creation of the expenditure account, the Wyoming Tomorrow expenditure account, which is to be made up of investment funds from the endowment account, which is created later, and any other appropriations appropriated to that specific account. Those funds are continuously appropriated, and then any unexpended and obligated are transferred to the reserve account at the end of the fiscal year. Page 5, lines 2 through 21 establishes the reserve account. This is to your point, Representative Summers, which serves to buttress the expenditure account in a similar manner as the Hathaway, to distribute to eligible institutions as necessary. At the end of the fiscal year, any amount in excess of the 12 million or the 9% of the previous 5-year average market value of Wyoming's Tomorrow Scholarship Endowment Fund will be moved back to the corpus. You can find on the bottom of the page, page 5, lines 21 through page 6, line 3. Those are reporting requirements back to the Joint Education Committee and the Select Committee on Capital Financing and Investments. Page 6, lines 5 through 7, and page 6, line 5 through page 7, line 18. These are the eligibility requirements for the scholarship program. You'll note that you have to be accepted or enrolled into an eligible institution to pursue a certificate of or degree. It requires 3 years of residency immediately preceding application. It requires that you are 24 years old and that you have not obtained a bachelor's degree, that you have completed the federal financial aid applications, that you have registered with the Workforce Service Department for training. And those can be found on pages 6 and 7. And then moving on to page 7, the bottom of page 7, line 20 through page 8, line 6. These are the provisions governing repayment or working to repay your debt to the state of Wyoming, for lack of a better word. It requires that you actively engage in 1 year of graduate school, or that you work in Wyoming full-time for every 4 semesters paid for under this act. Moving on to the repayment provisions, those can be found on page 8, lines 8 through page 9, line 2. In the event that you fail to complete the program or don't make satisfactory academic progress, the individual will be required to repay the scholarship, including interest. The interest will be dictated by the rate charged by the federal for federal student loans, but it's not to exceed 8%. Any amounts repaid will be attributed to the expenditure account. Moving on to page 9, lines 4 through 6. This limits the eligibility of an applicant to 4 academic terms. Page 9, lines 8 through page 10, lines 4 lists the criteria which disables a student from continuing to be, which are the eligibility requirements for a student. I apologize. And those prohibitions are: you're not a United States citizen, or a resident alien who meets the definition under Title IX. And there's also a provision for exception to this limitation for good cause. If you're in default of a federal Title IX education loan, if you owe a refund under the student financial aid or subsequently enacted program, if you're incarcerated, or if you're convicted of a felony and have not had your rights restored under Wyoming statute. And then the last provision, you can find that on page 10, lines 13 and 14, is if you don't otherwise qualify for a scholarship under this act. Page 10, line 18 through page 11, lines 7, outlines the scholarships awards, which is $1,500 per academic term for any unmet financial need. And I think that the committee has talked a little bit about this, but there is a provision for a fractional amount. There's no delineation or minimum on that. That can be found on page 11, lines 4 through 7. Moving on, page 11, lines 9 through 13. This again outlines the eligibility, or I guess the limits for eligibility to 4 full-time academic terms and a total of $6,000. Page 11, line 15 through page 16, line 6 outlines the eligibility requirements to remain eligible for the scholarship, including that you have satisfactory academic progress, which is comprised of completing 2/3 of the semester hours that you attempt, maintaining a cumulative grade point average of 2.0 evaluated at the end of the spring semester, and then meeting any other criteria established by the eligible institution. And then lastly, that you maintain continuous enrollment for not less than 2 academic terms in successive academic years. Lines 13 through 16 on page 12 state that in the event that you fail to meet the requirements of the satisfactory academic progress, you will be ineligible to receive another scholarship under this act. Moving on, 21-16-1905 on the bottom of page 12, lines 18 through page 17, line 9. These are the provisions governing the administration of the program. It requires that the program be administered jointly with the University of Wyoming and the Community College Commission, and it outlines various requirements associated with application and payment, and also requires rules and regulations be promulgated by those bodies to govern this program.
Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, sorry, if I don't ask a question kind of when I'm going along, I might forget it. So, Mr. Chairman, administered jointly. Currently, the Hathaway, right, is administered by WDE, is that correct? And you can answer, go ahead, you finish and somebody will find that answer for me.
Okay, go ahead.
I think I left off at page 13, line 14. And that governs the transfer of students between schools and requires that the schools, the eligible institutions, work together to identify those students to ensure that they're not counted duplicatively. Page 14, lines 1 through page 15, line 2. This also governs the administration in determining the amounts to be awarded and how those payments will take place, and the various reporting requirements of the commission and the University of Wyoming in requesting those funds. Page 15, line 4 through page 16, line 14. This outlines the payment from the expenditure account to the institution and requires the Community College Commission as well as the UW to review the list of recipients, and also outlines again the process in the event that there are duplicative students identified. Page 16, line 16 through 18 requires the university and the Community College Commission to promulgate rules in accordance with this provision, or excuse me, with this act. Page 16, line 20 through page 17, line 4. This requires an annual reporting requirement for UW and the Community College Commission, and also requires that they provide data for purposes of policy analysis and program evaluation, and provide accurate data to the legislature and the governor relative to the program's impact on the state and its students. Page 17, lines 6 through 9. This allows the Department of Audit to conduct audits of the scholarship program. Page 17, line 11 through page 18, line 4. These are additional funding considerations, and it outlines in the event sufficient funds are not available to pay, in what order those payments will be made and how those priority decisions will be operationalized. Page 18, line 6 through 13. This is the legislative oversight. It clarifies that it is not an entitlement and that the program can be terminated at any time. Page 18, line 15. This begins the amendment of existing statutes, as I stated previously. It creates a permanent fund. You can find that on page 19, lines 1 through 8, and then a conforming amendment on the bottom of page 19, lines 21 and 22. Last page, like page 20, lines 1 through 5, this is section 3. This again transfers $100 million from a location to be identified to the scholarship endowment fund, which is the permanent account that I previously mentioned. Section 4, this just identifies when the funds will become available and when the awards will be made from this program. And section 5, line 25 on page 20, provides that this act is effective July 1st of 2022.
Okay. Comments or questions from the committee before we go to,
Mr. Chairman.
yes.
Mr. Chairman, I don't have any questions, but I just want to do a brief comment, having served on that Wyoming Tomorrow's task force. So the committee understands, we patterned this, not verbatim, but we patterned it after an LCCC program, and Dr. Joe Schaefer came and kind of went through that program that he has, and that kind of led us to where we're at. I think it's not exactly like it, but it's got a lot of the same pieces and parts in it that program that LCCC had. So that's kind of where it came from, the language in particular. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I do have an answer to Representative Summers' question. The Hathaway is that entire article is administered by the Department of Education. And that makes sense in that those students are high school students graduating from Wyoming high schools. This is a non-traditional student program. And so it would make sense that the administration of those would be dealt with in the commission, the university.
Ed.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I think in one part in here, it said joint rulemaking, which seemed a bit awkward. That's why I'm wondering if the big programmatic piece maybe sits somewhere else. I don't know. That just seemed, and that question was raised to me by the good senator over here, Senator Ellis. And it did seem odd to me that we had joint rulemaking between those.
Representative Harshman.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just, as I'm trying to recall, and some of these folks, really, that was the University and Community College said, yes, we can do this together in some of our meetings. That wasn't like any of our ideas, and I think they can respond to that, really, is how.
Mr. Chairman. Oh, sorry.
Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just looking at our administrative rules where they're all housed, I don't believe the University of Wyoming has rulemaking authority. The commission does. So this is an important issue. I know we're looking at the clock, and I'll just be blunt with my colleagues here. If we continue to work this, I think I've got a number of amendments, and we can hash through them paragraph by paragraph that I think deserve a lot more consideration from our group. Rulemaking, who's going to administer this is just one of many issues. So I think I just wanted to make that known to the committee, and also offer that along the lines of the big discussion we just had, I'd be happy to organize with my colleague down the dais here, another working group to try and come up with maybe a substitute proposal for our next meeting, and open that up to anyone on the committee who wants to work it between now and our next meeting. I just know we're running out of time, and I think we're all looking a little fatigued.
I think that'd be a good suggestion.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, that's fine. I'd be glad to work with Senator Ellis to see if we can't hash out some changes. She's talked to me about many of them. I don't have a problem. They're individual policy decisions. We can come back and make a recommendation, and the committee can take it from there.
Okay. Sounds good. Yes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Just a question on, under the bill, the way it's written right now, does a student who has received Hathaway money in the past, is that student eligible for this later? And where is that in the bill that they are not?
Page 7, line 13 and 14.
Mr. Chairman, follow up.
Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Representative.
Lines 13 and 14 say the student is not eligible for a Hathaway scholarship. They wouldn't be at the time it doesn't say or ever, or never was. It just says that you could take that to mean is not eligible at that moment. But they're filing for the 6,000.
Good catch. Anything else?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Mr.
Two.
Co-Chairman.
2 items. Fund.
There you go.
Okay, and my suggestion is 50 million, because this one, there will be, unlike the previous one, where it's just adding money to the colleges to spend, this one, you're gonna have some real administrative expenses, creating a scholarship program, creating the application, processing them, and we ought to have a significant amount of income to fund a significant number of these, or it's a waste until we build up to a trigger. And I suggest 50 million, but that's subject to negotiation. But I think it ought to kick in once we've got to a certain level in the endowment. And then strategically, I do think that a nominal appropriation is a better approach, because then we can adapt to circumstances easily. That's a matter of legislative tactics. Doesn't require a lot of drafting, which is something we can do next time. And then I would have one suggestion back in the bill. On page 10, line 6, we exclude people that have been convicted of a felony and haven't had their rights restored. I think this was copied from the Hathaway. That makes sense there because the Hathaway is geared to people just coming out of high school. And if they've been convicted of an offense, it's something quite recent. Here, you could have people that were quite a ways out of the high school and had rehabilitated themselves. And really, this would be a big help. And frankly, I had a relative in another state that had a program like this. He was convicted of a felony for certain things that he did when younger. He rehabilitated himself and needed to get some further education so he could really do a good job supporting his family. Used the Georgia Hope Scholarship Program to get trained as an over-the-road truck driver. And it was quite successful that way. And I would hope the committee could look at that and knock out the automatic prohibition and maybe say they have to be not convicted of a felony, or if convicted of felony, not convicted of another serious offense within some time period. So that we don't exclude this as a tool to help people rehabilitate themselves.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Senator Ellis brought that up, as did Senator Biteman when we were having a side conversation. So Senator Ellis can craft something good there because I think there is nuances there that we'll have to look at.
Senator Ellis.
Mr. Chairman, and my conversations with my colleague down the line, I think the way this is crafted, it seems to be really exclusionary. I think if we took a fresher look at it, I think we would want to open up broad and then maybe identify some preference systems within it. You know, are there careers that workforce services and the colleges and the university identify together that are a priority for our state, maybe create a preference for awarding scholarships on those bases? I mean, I think that some of these concepts that are automatic disqualifiers now could maybe be looked at and kind of stuffed into that metric of how they award. And I would hope, you know, if we have one clear rule maker, we'd rely on them to write some good rules too. So I think that's the kind of thought that's the kind of direction I think this bill maybe should need to go, instead of all these automatic disqualifiers, because we want people going back to school. That's the whole thrust. And to me, the bill's not structured that way.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, and I get subject to Senator Ellis's, what her thoughts are, but I'd like to have her and I maybe in a Zoom draw in Joe Schaefer, and then we can kind of hash out all this stuff and see what fits. He had a really good idea of how to work all this, and I think that'd be great if we could drag him into it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Along the incarceration point, I think I could understand where a community college would get nervous about awarding scholarships, because they don't have quite that policy preference that we all enjoy here on this dais. So I think that there might be some distinctions that maybe drive a scholarship developed by a particular college differently than considerations that we're not necessarily sensitive to or have to be sensitive to. We can go a completely different way.
Okay. Yes,
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Co-Chairman.
I would ask the members that are working on this, take a look at Article 16, Section 20 in the Constitution, where we're protecting higher education trust funds from and making them inviolate. This bill is designed with some provisions here, I think, to take advantage of that. But there are it does need to be for higher education, which I think includes anything community colleges do. But I think we need to be a little sensitive to that, because I've heard some suggestions for broadening this that might knock us out from the protections involved here.
Representative Harshman.
Mr. Chairman, then if, the group, I think same issue kind of with the Hathaway on page 4 and 5. On paragraph A and B really is this expenditure and reserve account. And I just think, because this is set up, this is a copy right from the Hathaway. So you're going to have that same deal, taking money, out of the left pocket, right pocket, back to the left pocket. And I think it can be accomplished. Staff is going to work that amendment up for that Hathaway bill. It's really boilerplate, would fit right in here, whether it's 9% or 6% or whatever we decide as a policy. But I think it eliminates this back and forth sweep. So I think if we could get that straightened out on page 4 and 5.
Yeah, good point. Anything else from the committee before we go to public testimony? All right, let's open it up to public testimony. Looks like our public has returned.
Hi, we're back.
Okay, who's going to be first here?
Again, I'll just kick it off real quick. Again, my name is Erin Taylor. I'm the Executive Director of the Wyoming Association of Community College Trustees. Super excited about this bill. We've been talking about these concepts for a long time, actually, and I'll just remind the committee that if you look back to the workings coming out of the Endow Initiative, leading to the Higher Education Attainment Council, leading us into the conversations that we've had about the applied bachelorette or applied baccalaureate degree, applied bachelorette. I'm getting tired. Wyoming Works, all of these things provide increased opportunities for access to higher education. And we have scientific data that shows that correlates to increased economic activity in our state. So that's why we're all here. And we would be happy to provide any resources to the work group. I know Dr. Schaefer's listening and he's excited to participate. So whatever you need from me, just let me know and I'm happy to be there.
Dr. Caldwell.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, really the same. I do have some specific items in here that I wanted to bring up, but I can do that with the working group. We did work through a lot of aspects in Wyoming Works that we could pull into to make sure that the language is going to work. We also, a few things that I wanted to also bring up to you to consider within this. Not that I'm not recommending necessarily to do this, but you might want to consider that. And that is the Overseas Combat Veterans funding and the Wyoming Investment in Nursing student grant could potentially be pulled into this. And then also the Earn While You Learn student internships. So I wanted to bring those up, just the Overseas Combat Veterans and the Wyoming student grant, which took a serious hit in the budget cuts could be accounted for in here and pull off about $1 million. It's currently having to come out of the general fund appropriation. So there's capacity in this to do that. The other types of edits that you have a work group, I'd be very happy to work with those because we do have some experience in how some things might work.
Thank you. Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I certainly would contemplate involving both of you in that discussion, and to anyone listening on the Zoom, just reach out to the chairs, myself, LSO, whoever, and let us know if you'd like to be looped in so we can make sure we get you invited to Zoom or conference call meetings. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else for public testimony? Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Cindy Delancey. I'm the president of the Wyoming Business Alliance, and on behalf of our 300 plus members in every industry, large, small, east side of the state, west side of the state, wherever, we just want to say thank you. This concept is so important right now for every aspect of our business community. So many of you have worked so hard on this that I just can't even tell you how excited I am to see such broad support for the concept. I completely agree with Senator Ellis that maybe sometimes you have to take a step back before you can go forward so we can iron out these details. Because I get the sense that this is our one shot to move this bill forward. And I offer my support, Senator, to the working group. However, the business community can be a resource to you in the community colleges. We stand at the ready. This is our number one priority, is to be able to help our Wyoming citizens have a pathway to be able to empower themselves, increase their earning capacity, improve their skill set, and be able to fill some of these vacancies so we can keep our state at an economic, advantage in our region. So I won't belabor the point. I think you know where I'm at on this. I stand at the ready. Anything we can do to help this committee and the entire body move this forward. We have an enormous responsibility to future generations to get this right, and we will do whatever we can to assist you in that effort. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Cindy. Anyone else? Public testimony? Anyone online?
No online comment, no.
No online comment. All right. Well, it seems that the bill has a lot of support. Just not ready for prime time. We've got some volunteers that are going to polish it up and make it look good. And we'll carry it over to the next meeting, if that's agreeable to everyone. Let's see, what else do we have on our agenda?
Chairman, Mr. Chairman, do I
Yes.
need to make a motion for like a bill to get a bill draft? No, I just want to make sure. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Co-Chair.
Other than if you want to call from general public comment, I don't know whether we'll get any or not, but other than that, let's adjourn.
That's what I was going to ask, if there's any general public comment on any of the topics that we've covered so far. Seeing none. Yes, we do have one.
Once again, I'm Kathy Dolan, Casper College trustee, Representative Paxton, Senator Scott, committee members. I just want to thank you for the attention you've given to the community college issues and your very deliberative discussion. On behalf of the trustees, we appreciate it very, very much. Students are our passion, students of any age. And the community college is coming under the JEC. It's added to your workload, but it's going to pay off for all of us, all of our students and all of our citizens. And thank you again for your attention and consideration of the bills before you that will affect the community colleges and our citizens as a whole.
Thank you. Very proud of our community colleges in Wyoming, doing a great job. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, any final? Yes, LSO.
Mr. Chairman, just a reminder, your actual next meeting is October 11th. It'll be a joint meeting between the Joint Appropriations Committee and this committee to consider the external cost adjustment on K-12 education. You'll receive the monitoring report from LSO along with the Department of Education and the legislative consultant, Dr. Stoddard, on teacher cost pressure. So I just wanted to put that bug in your ear.
And that's a Zoom meeting, correct?
Mr. Chairman, correct. That'll be a virtual meeting online on Zoom.
Okay. Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, I just have a question of Matt, kind of historical question. Has it ever been, obviously the court case said ECA every 2 years, we do it every year. Has it ever been contemplated or has there ever been a bill filed to try every 2 years, or has it always remained on that 1 year schedule ever since that statute was passed? I mean, had there ever been an effort to go to every 2 years?
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Summers, I believe the statute's been written that the legislature considers an ECA in years between recalibrations, which would be every year that you're not recalibrating the model. And so whether the legislature enacts a ECA, I think that was more of the court's language, is that you have to provide an ECA every 2 years. But the legislature has always, I guess, considered it in the years between the recalibrations.
Thank you.
Okay. Any final comments from anyone? All right. Meeting is adjourned. Do that all day.